Zimbabwe Installing a True Democratic State. By Terence Simbi. Preface. Zimbabwe, Installing a True Democratic State. My second book is hardly different from the first book, The Next Zimbabwe, in terms of structure and objectives. All these books are brought to life through the compilation of previously published articles in newspapers and political blog sites. The objectives of these books are centered on creating an open, honest and just political culture aimed at uniting the nation towards greater economic success and political stability. Zimbabwe, Installing a True Democratic State, looks at areas of realignment of Zimbabwe's constitutional, governance, political order and culture in the midst of deep political divisions, tensions and undemocratic practices. In the book the writer tackles conspiracies and age-old issues of political contestation, from what is meant by democracy, the United States of America sanctions bills against Zimbabwe, the land question and the Gukurahundi massacre. The book explains misconceptions and proffers remedial actions to all these challenges. These issues are analyzed from the perspective of an independent, non-partisan young Zimbabwean born after the liberation struggle against white domination. Chapter 1. The History of Democracy. In this Chapter 1 we'll answer key questions concerning the origins of democracy and then outline issues its creation sought to address. I will achieve this by narrating events that led to its creation, then end by highlighting key expectations and responsibilities carried out by individuals in the execution of this governance system. The aim of this section is on understanding what democracy meant historically with the view of comparing it to modern-era democracies. Historically, nation and state governance has always been an issue of great contention and significant evolution over time. The most famous historical book, the Bible, traces for us the people of Israel and their own governance journey. The Israeli journey begins with prophets, evolving to judges, and then to kings being the heads of the people. This governance evolution is also quite evident and true for each and every other nation in the world. Around 500 BC, years ago, a polis, city-state, in Greece called Athens embarked on a governance experiment whereby the people led by Cleisthenes sought to govern themselves in what is known as democracy. All recorded civilization before this experiment in Athens itself had all been led by kings, archons, assisted by their preferred fellow aristocratic noblemen in what are known as oligarchic governance systems. Besides nobility and the inheritance route, Athens and other civilizations' leadership posts were also attained by the use of military might. If a fellow aristocrat or strongman felt disenfranchised or had great ambition on being king, the only option was staging a coup against the sitting king. Before we focus on the governmental elements of the full democratic period instituted by Cleisthenes between 508 BC ending in 338 BC, where Athens was conquered by Philip II of Macedonia, it is important for us to go back to events 100 years preceding that democratic revolution. All along, Athens had been led by a premier archon, chief magistrate, whom at first had unlimited term limits in office that were then reduced to 10 years, then, in the end, limited to 1 year. The premier archons were assisted by the Areopagus, that was a council made up of ex-archons. In 621 BC, Premier Archon Draco created a written law code to replace the oral law code that the courts had to enforce. This made Athens the first Greek city-state and ancient nation to have a written law code. In 594 BC, Solon, Premier Archon, moved towards the first form of representative democracy by defining citizenship for Athenian residents. Solon created an assembly in which all these citizens that owned property could participate in. The Areopagus roles then changed to being an overseer of the written law code, with its previous function of setting the daily political agenda going to a newly formed council of 400 members. This council of 400 had its membership made up of 100 members from each of the 4 aristocratic tribes of Athens. The point to note in Solon's democracy was that it was greatly exclusive, as the main qualifications for membership were on the levels of possession, good standing, being able to pay debts, and family connections. 1. Solon and his democratic changes were quite revolutionary and far-reaching in comparison to other civilizations then. However, The major criticism of his democracy was that it reaffirmed the previously held social class structure, as citizenship was limited to those of the previous aristocratic class. This system meant limited opportunities for other citizens lower down the social ladder, resulting in them being unable to prosper and more significantly participate in decision-making. Seeing these loopholes in 561 BC, an aristocratic nobleman in Pisistratos overthrew the aristocratic-dominated democratic system, establishing an autocratic tyrannical governance system. His reign was more favorable to ordinary Athenians, as he saw the potential for growing the economic status of a greater portion of them, to the displeasure of the aristocratic class. His policies were on extending credit facilities that created opportunities for those lower down the social ladder of Athens. Pisistratos increased spending on public buildings and built fountain houses that increased the water supply of the city. The economy of Athens grew greatly, as many ordinary Athenians were now able to venture into farming olives, start crafts like pottery, provide voyage services and enter the export trade. Olive oil was the major cash crop used in the production of cooking oils, soaps and fuels. Olives are crops that require an average of 10 years to mature, thus Pisistratos' reign provided that stability. It is important to note that these great changes in the economic fortunes of Athenians happened more greatly in the administration of Pisistratos, a tyrant using an exclusively autocratic governance system. Pisistratos died in 527 BC and was succeeded by his two sons Hippias and Hipparchus. The two initially continued on the legacy and deeds of their father by supporting the lower classes of Athenian society, to the continued displeasure of the aristocratic class. This prompted the aristocrats to organize and assassinate Hipparchus in 514 BC. Hippias, the remaining archon, became more cruelly and tyrannical than ever. Hippias executed those who had killed his brother in public view and became a leader mainly focused on self-preservation. These scenarios are common in modern times, where a leader might initially possess a genuine cause, but as attempted coups are foiled and enemies push on and on, their reign might change to be exclusively focused on self-preservation. Athens became very unstable as Hippias used an iron fist to rule. He continued carrying out public executions and increased the tax burden of ordinary citizens. These conditions prompted successive coups and power struggles between 510 BC and 508 BC, where the people of Athens staged a revolution. Cleisthenes, an aristocratic member of the Alcmaeonide clan that had been exiled under the reign of Hippias' father Pisistratos, was the first to strike down the reign of Hippias, ceasing power as chief archon. Another rival aristocrat, Isagoras, with the assistance of the Spartan military, a rival polis, overthrew the leadership of Cleisthenes as he fled Athens for exile. Isagoras and Cleisthenes were both aristocrats that were all focused on attaining power for themselves. This power struggle had led Isagoras to acquire military might from a rival Greek polis, Sparta, to invade his homeland. In this period of power struggles, conditions for ordinary Athenians continued to deteriorate, leading to the revolution of 508 BC. The revolution saw ordinary Athenians taking up arms against Isagoras and his Spartan allies, trapping them on the Acropolis for 2 days. On the third day a truce was made, allowing the Spartans and Isagoras to escape, and executing 300 of Isagoras' supporters. Cleisthenes then returned to the city and became premier archon. Cleisthenes, observing these developments in which ordinary citizens significantly contributed to the overthrowing of the tyrant government of Isagoras, was forced to make far-reaching reforms to accommodate all of Athens' citizenry. These were the events that led to the creation of a governance system in which all of Athens' citizenry, rich or poor, with possession or not, could equally participate with equal rights and privileges. Democracy in Greek language comes from demos, meaning the whole citizen living in a polis, with kratos, meaning power to rule. In simpler interpretations, this is said to mean the people's right to rule themselves or the government of the people. After highlighting the events leading to the creation of democracy, I will now go into the institutions and responsibilities of individuals. Cleisthenes firstly abolished the 4 aristocratic-based tribes that had previously dominated the political arena, creating 10 new tribes or political blocks based on location called demes. This location-based political block had to have an equal-like portion of a city. Inland and coastal region constituted by varying social classes. The Council of 400 that had existed under Solon was changed to a council of 500 members. The council's membership was made up from 50 members that were randomly selected in each of the 10 political blocs. The council's membership was reserved for all Athenian citizens that could serve only 2 non-consecutive terms of 1 year in their entire life. The function of this council can be likened to that of the modern parliament, as it was in charge of setting the agenda for debate in the assembly, preparing proposed legislation and running the daily administrative functions of Athens. An assembly of the entire general citizenship of the around 30,000 citizens in Athens at that time had the ultimate decision-making ability. All male citizens from the age of 18 were eligible to attend these assembly meetings, having the right to address fellow citizens, propose laws and presenting public lawsuits challenging any previous laws. The Council of 500 was the one that provided order for the assembly meetings but could not control the outcomes of decisions made by the assembly. All motions brought forth by the council were to be debated on then voted upon by every citizen in attendance either for or against through a majority vote of 50% plus 1 vote. The agenda and law proposals brought by the council to the assembly for debate were greatly influenced by the citizens who wrote proposals on any matter, with the council just considering its appropriateness first. Decisions from declaring war with other city-states and nations, increasing or decreasing taxation levels, public spending, alliance creation or any other governance issue were all made by the whole assembly through a simple majority vote in the scheduled 4 assembly meetings a month or any other emergency assembly meeting. The minimum number of Athenian citizens required to provide a quorum legalizing an assembly meeting was 6,000 citizens. In most issues, knowledge on how fellow citizens' perspective were known by everyone, for the decision-making process was by the show of hands. This is symbolic to modern democracies, as the respect for fellow citizens' right to agree or differ from self, coupled with knowledge of having equal decision-making power, has been overshadowed by lobbying and political groupings. In ancient Athens, anyone had the right to speak for or against any proposed agenda or matter and in the end vote for or against without any upper hand for certain political groups or individuals within Athenian society. A nobleman, potter, farmer, poet, teacher or shipmaker had equal political rights and protections under the law. At the demi-levels, members also regularly met to deliberate and institute local by-laws on issues that concerned the regional area. The judicial system was more interesting as it brought the idea of juries. Athenian courts were presided over by jurors made up of fellow Athenians that would have volunteered to serve in them as judges for cases. The selection of jurors to cases was random and done daily, with the size of juries ranging from 201 up to 1501 depending on the type and significance of cases. The randomness in selection and large jury size were done to prevent jurors from being biased towards certain perspectives, and also prevented corruption, for if jurors knew well beforehand the cases they were assigned to, litigants could bribe them. A single court case's duration and verdict on it was supposed to last and passed in a single day. Decisions were arrived from a majority vote made by jurors that did not first deliberate before making a secret ballot vote. The litigants were personally responsible for making their arguments through reading their pre-written speeches and answering questions from jurors. The redress was also found from proposals made by the accused and defended. The jury also had to vote on whether to adopt the redress proposed by the accused or the defended. The fourth and final institution, which can be likened to our modern executive branch of government in ancient Athens, was made up of 10 strategos, 1 from each of the 10 tribes and 9 archons. These positions were filled by elections, for ability was the biggest quality required. These positions had 1-year term limits with yearly elections to fill vacancies. The 10 strategos and 9 archons were responsible for implementing the military mandate and other administrative decisions set by the assembly. They could not act in their own passions but executed mandates that had been placed upon them by the entire assembly. This body was very different from the modern executive branch of government, with equal powers to other branches, as it could not act on its own behalf. The members that constituted this strategos and archon branch of government, yearly on expiry of their term of office, were subjected to rigorous audits of their conduct and finances whilst in office. The ultimate tool that Cleisthenes also created to prevent anyone in Athens gaining too much political power, championing a certain cause or leading a political faction is ostracism. In ostracism, a citizen found to be too powerful from a general vote in the assembly receiving more than 6,000 votes would have to be expelled from Athens for a period of 10 years. At the end of the 10 years these individuals and their family would however be readmitted, thus repossessing possessions credited to them before being ostracized. These reforms, checks and balances were all meant for the Athenian political system to never ever be dominated by any single individual, aristocrat, profession, rights grouping or tribe. It is important to note that in the lifespan of the Athenian democracy in 404 BC it was replaced by oligarchy. This was the period of the rule of the 30 tyrants when Athens had been defeated by Sparta, its neighboring rival Greek city-state. This period of oligarchy was short-lived. Within a year full democracy was reinstituted when Athens overthrew the rule of the 30 tyrants. Following the collapse of Athens and its democracy in 338 BC, as it was conquered by Philip II of Macedonia, no other ancient or modern state or nation has ever had this kind of direct democracy. The Romans at the beginning of their empire in 27 BC, drew inspiration from the Athenians, creating democratic institutions like the assembly called comitia centuriata, a senate that was the legislative body and the consuls the executive branch. The core existence of these Roman institutions was however problematic as they lacked checks and balances in the avoidance of powerful influential individuals and political groupings. The members of the Senate were selected from the assembly that had representatives from the different tribes and territories. In turn the Senate was the one that selected those who were to serve in the consuls. The assembly's membership was greatly determined by an individual's wealth and family ties. As the Roman Republic started expanding in territory and population, its representative type of democracy began to suffer from the influence of powerful families referred to as the patricians. A system of patronage developed, weakening the democratic elements, resulting in the majority of its citizens having little say in their government. The end of the Roman Empire and its democracy came in the reign of Julius Caesar, who disregarded most of these institutions in his time, resulting in him being murdered. The murder led to serious internal power struggle, division and collapse of the empire. These two ancient democracies, the Athenians and Roma, were instrumental in the creation of modern democracies, for the founding fathers of modern democracies drew most of their ideas from them. Chapter 2. Modern Democracies. The story of modern democracies is closely linked to the formation of the United States of America, USA, in 1776 that followed the American Revolution against British rule. The creation of USA from former British colonies, now referred to as states, had been necessitated by the same reasons, aspirations and desires held by ancient Athenians in wanting to possess the power and responsibilities towards shaping their own destinies. In this chapter we are going to look at how this modern great union of states possessing enormous geographical area, massive population size and revolutionary ideals sought to respond to these aspirations and desires. We are also going to briefly establish how democracies then developed in Europe and then look at African democracies. In closing, we are going to analyze the current state of democracy as a governance system in the midst of the technological revolution and postmodern era. The American Revolution against British rule occurred when American colonies that had been established by the British Empire in the Americas started expanding. These colonies were prone to attacks from rivals in the French, native Indians and the Spanish-aligned forces in various conflicts, and thus the British Empire had to constantly defend them. This defense often amounted to huge costs, thus the British Crown had to pay back these huge debts through some form of revenue collection. Since they had been defending these American colonies, the British Parliament decided to impose various taxes on them without their consent. The American colonists, evoking democratic principles, argued that the British Parliament could not tax them for they were not represented in it. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," challenged British rule over them. These were the seeds that led to the revolution, coupled with sabotage acts on goods being sent to Britain by her American colonies. In another incident, British standing troops in Boston shot and killed several of her American colonists that were protesting against the enforcement of these unpopular tax laws. This meant that a full armed conflict between Britain and her American colonies had begun. After the revolution had been won by the American colonists declaring independence on the 4th of July 1776, the American founding fathers proclaimed liberty throughout all the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. These founding fathers were also tasked with forming a government to run the affairs of this new nation made up of 13 previously British colonies. The states and their representatives initially made a faulty start when they met to create the first draft of rules to run this nation referred to as the Article of Confederation in 1776. Due to the desire of abolishing the concept of a king-like figure that would control all the affairs of the individual states without their consent as did the British royal family, much of the powers were then left to the individual states. The Articles of Confederation did not provide for a leader, creating only the legislative body Congress made up of the 13 state representatives. To ratify laws required the consent of 9 or more state representatives, and changing the Articles of Confederation themselves required the consent of all 13 states. These conditions lead to a weak federal, central, government that could not raise taxes, provide the common defense since individual states had their own militias with no federal troops. Trade distortions were common for states could tax each other for various products and services as they wished. The Confederation rules were unattainable, creating various tensions between states as they limited the federal government in obliging them on any matter. Following 11 years of running the nation with these rules, delegates from 12 states with the exception of Rhode Island met again in a Constitution Convention to come up with a new concept of government. 55 delegates from the various states big and small came to this convention in Philadelphia, the likes of George Washington, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. These delegates had conducted their own prior research on ancient forms of governments. The Athenian and Roman democratic setups were favored by James Madison, with Hamilton favoring a royal family aristocratic-dominated type of government. There were many views and opinions out there on how to progress, and from the beginning it was clear that compromise, openness on the part of delegates and clear decision-making rules had to be applied to make this convention successful. 2 key decisions were made at the commencement of the convention that made the environment ideal, first being the appointment of George Washington chairperson of the deliberations. Washington was impartial and respected by every delegate, from being the commander of the Revolutionary Army that had been victories 11 years back. The second and most important condition was conducting the deliberations in complete secrecy with no media coverage allowed. A moratorium of 40 years was placed on revealing and publishing resolutions, information about particular delegates' views, votes on resolutions and compromises made. What this meant was that delegates could openly share their opinions and compromise away from initial positions after considering other delegates' arguments in complete confidence. This is a point in which our own current Zimbabwean politicians can take in the face of their differing political positions and various media platforms around today. If they decide to deliberate in earnestly, publishing political positions won't help in any form of compromise environment and outcomes. The first resolution in the convention was on creating a government made up of 3 separate branches acting as checks and balances towards each other that are the legislative branch in Congress, the executive and the judiciary. The Congress had to represent all the people of America in their different states that could not all be included in government. It was to be made up of the lower House of Representatives and upper House in Senate. A compromise on the composition and method of admission in these 2 houses was struck when a huge debate between the big and small states over influence in the government had transpired. The House of Representatives was to be filled based on population within the states, with the Senate having 2 seats reserved for each state in what is known as the Great Compromise. The main functions of Congress were on enacting the laws of the land on behalf of the people and also ensuring that the executive acted in the best interests of the people as it was accountable to the Congress. The executive branch was to be a separate branch headed by the president chosen by the people through electors with different weightings for different states using the electoral college system. The president was to execute his agenda through the appointing of cabinet secretaries, ministers, and advisors as he/she best saw fit. For appointments to the executive, cabinet secretaries could not simultaneously be members of Congress or the judiciary like in Zimbabwe, where cabinet posts are mainly reserved for members of parliament. The American founders designed it in this way after considering differences in functionality, accountability, and agency issues involved. The judiciary was the final branch tasked with the sound, impartial, just interpretation and application of the laws of the land and constitutional provisions. The Judiciary Supreme Court was to be made up of justices that were nominated by the president but for appointment had to go through public Senate interviews and confirmation votes. In these public interviews and confirmation votes, the Senate represented the states and its people and acted as a check against a captured judiciary by the executive branch. For the lower courts in the states, the local state congresses were responsible for the appointment of judges. States were also to apply law codes for their local affairs that had to be in line with federal laws. Trials involving capital crimes, those that warranted the death penalty, and other serious crimes brought back the concept of grand juries made up of fellow citizens that acted as judges like those of ancient Athens. The other issue of agreement were the high standards set on the amendment of the Constitution in response to changing times and circumstances. Previously, amendments were unattainable, for they required the consent of all states in the Articles of Confederation. One issue the convention could not solve but kicked the can on future leaders like Abraham Lincoln was that of slavery. The Northern delegates wanted slavery abolished there and then, with Southern delegates against the idea, for the South's economy was heavily reliant on the practice. Northern delegates then disputed that state population figures could include enslaved blacks since they were yet to possess voting rights. The Southern delegates, however, insisted slaves be counted, thereby, together increasing population figures and Congress representatives for Southern states. A compromise to count one enslaved black man as 3/5 of a man was made. These were the major compromises that were made for the United States of American government to commence its function after the convention and ratification of the agreed Constitution. This system of government was very much different from the direct democracy of Athens in that the American founding fathers wanted to guard against reactionary decisions made from assembly-like meetings of the whole population that could have been greatly affected by demagogy. The founders wanted the opinions of the people to be first filtered in local town hall community meetings, then carried by representatives to the different houses that were expected to conduct an intellectual type of debate in Congress. To control the representatives and ensure conduct was in the interest of the communities they represented, House representatives were subjected to election every 2 years, senators every 6th year, with the presidential election occurring every 4th year. State governments were also to retain significant powers in running their daily affairs without federal government interference. State government functions were from collecting taxes to building roads, borrowing money, establishing courts, making and enforcing local laws, chartering banks and corporations, issuing land title, spending money on the general welfare of the state, and many other state functions. It is important to note that all these provisions in the USA Constitution were made without the contribution and existence of political parties. Early on in the execution of the government of the USA, the period in which Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of Treasury, was advocating for the creating of the Bank of United States between 1787 to 1791, issues of powers that could be exercised by the federal government in relation to state government functions became significantly divisive. These were the arguments that bore the seeds to political factions and the creation of political parties, with some founding fathers favoring limited federal government powers whilst others favoring greater federal government powers in relation to state government powers. The issues of federal to state government powers, getting a presidential candidate with a state profile acquiring a national appeal, and candidates from the same state fighting over limited votes in presidential elections finally lead to the creating of national political parties. This period was when non-founding fathers in Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams were running for the office of president. Andrew Jackson lost the presidency to John Quincy Adams, although he had carried the popular vote but failed to attain the Electoral College vote for. There were 2 other candidates that had split the vote. To settle the issue, the president was then voted for by Congress that chose John Quincy Adams' son to John Adams, the second president. The chief architect to this national political party system was Martin Van Buren when he was the campaign manager of Andrew Jackson's presidential bid. Van Buren argued that this will help candidates in creating national profiles, reducing tensions and splitting votes for candidates from similar states. He also argued that those possessing similar agendas and ideas would first have to fight out in an orderly manner to get the political party's candidature, and most importantly this would allow people in different states with the same beliefs working together towards a common national goal and vision in unity. Many of the Founding Fathers expressed reservations when national political parties emerged. They urged that rather than Congress representatives acting and delivering on the interests of communities they represent, they could now be focused on the interests of the national political party, thus violate the people's right to representation in the democracy. It is important to note that between 1861 and 1865 the United States of America was submerged in civil war pitting the northern and southern states. Several southern states had seceded from the Union, wanting to maintain the practice of slavery and retain state government powers as opposed to powerful federal government that was now moving towards banning slavery in all states under the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. In Europe the route to democracy was different to the one taken by the United States of America. At the end of the American Revolution all the major countries in Europe were still controlled by monarchies with limited-styled parliamentary governments dominated by aristocrats and the clergy. The 18th century for Europe had been a century of enlightenment as philosophy, the printing press and educational institutions had blossomed and were now readily accessible to the peasant masses. The French Revolution of 1789 occurred when the now enlightened French third-class citizens that constituted 98% of the population rose against King Louis XVI, the aristocrats and the clergy that constituted the upper classes. These lower-class citizens were demanding more political rights and freedoms. The revolution in France was game-changing for both Europe's peasant population and monarchies. Many nobles, aristocrats and clergy members that had dominated the previous government structure had to flee France. This situation left various groupings with differing agendas fighting to impose themselves as rulers. A period of chaos and anarchy transpired between 1789 and 1804 with various groupings of powerful leaders that were against the democratic ideals of the revolution fighting to impose their dominance in the new political order. This situation was ended by an army general named Napoleon who emerged defeating all other groupings, thus becoming Emperor of France in 1804. Napoleon favored and fought for the ideals of the revolution that were liberty, equality, and fraternity as he inserted democratic principles across France. He derived his authority from and by introducing a new constitution and legal code promoting freedom of religion, abolishing hereditary privileges and enforcing the principle of equality before the law for all men. The propagation of democracy in France also became a major existential threat to other monarchies across Europe. With the blessing and assistance of former French royals, aristocrats, and the clergy, other monarchies across Europe attempted twice without success to stage the invasion of France. Their mission was the overthrow of Emperor Napoleon with his democratic government and restoration of the French monarchy. Napoleon, being the army general he was, knew that the best form of defense was attack. He then went on the offensive, invading other European territories, in the process establishing French democratic principle across European society. Napoleon was however defeated in 1815 when he attempted to conquer Russia. All the other great powers of Europe met in Vienna aiming to restore the rule of monarchies. During all these political changes Europe also experienced an industrial revolution. The Industrial Revolution saw the growth of industries and mass manufacturing being spearheaded by the invention of the steam engine powered by coal as the main energy source became popular. 15. Other inventions that were made between 1760 and 1840 also led to increased productivity throughout Europe. This industrial revolution also gave birth to a middle-class workforce that provided labor for these industries, with Britain being the most industrialist nation in the 1870s. This working middle class initially organized itself as trade unions demanding better working conditions. European industries had been places where workers were subjected to long working hours, strict operating rules, low wages, and poor safety conditions. The fight to improve these working conditions and subsequent success in gaining them emboldened this new working middle class and its labor unions in demanding greater political rights. Due to pressure, the abolishment of slavery in Britain and labor union groupings that lobbied strongly, European monarchies gradually granted these voting rights to its working population across Europe. The European democratic ideals are quite different from the Athenian and American ideals. The root and democratic setups are different in that the roles of monarchies were not completely abolished as an institution in Europe. Those monarchies that reacted quickly in granting democratic rights to their populations managed to retain their status, relevance and limited governmental roles. The nations in which monarchies are now abolished either delayed in granting these democratic rights or were conquered after the First or Second World War, making the re-establishment of the institution difficult. Modern European democracies are mainly driven and dominated by groupings in political parties, labor unions and other pressure groupings, as the attainment of their democratic status was greatly shaped by these groupings. At the moment, Europe is also trying to find functionality as a bloc of several nations in what is called the European Union. The emergence of democracy on the African continent is also very much different from all democratic setups and beliefs I have alluded to before. Before I go further, it is now quite evident that the belief system and standards of democracy are to a greater extent heavily influenced by the route taken in the attainment of democratic status for a particular continent or nation. The Berlin Conference between 1884 and 1885 saw European countries gathering to partition the African continent. This had been a direct result of the Industrial Revolution, which saw mass production and greater trade among European nations. This revolution also meant that European nations required a constant supply of raw materials in coal, agricultural produce, and other minerals required for these productive industries. Africa became the primary source of these natural resources. Due to tensions whereby different European nations had for long periods clashed over claims and territory, the conference aimed to ease these tensions. The conference then partitioned the continent to various European nations, creating clear boundaries and territorial claims. The partitioning exercise did not, however, consider the ethnic and tribal makeup of the native African inhabitants. After the conference, various European nations went on to occupy their partitioned and allotted territories using significant military force. The African indigenous population was then subjected to apartheid as it was forced off its land. The colonial powers settled our forefathers in the infertile parts as they took charge of the best lands and mineral claims. The colonial masters also set up government structures that were dominated by the minority white settlers, subjecting the indigenous locals to strict law codes and restrictive measures on movement and ownership of property. After the Second World War, the United Nations was formed, being an international body opposed to the practice of slavery and apartheid. European nations had to relinquish colonized territories across Africa and other parts of the world. Many African nations then gained independence in the 1960s decade as many colonial powers respected the resolution. Territories in the sub-Saharan region where the colonists themselves had set up separate security structures in their own police force, secret police agencies and military units did not comply with the resolution, thereby defying their European government's directives. In several African countries under colonization post the 1960s decade, the local black population had to form political movements and later on guerrilla fighting wings to fight off the minority white-dominated governments with the aim of establishing majority rule. After the transfer of power from colonial powers or attainment through armed struggles, the new African nations have found it difficult to fully implement competent democratic governments. The first challenge comes from the partitioning of the African continent in the 19th century, as the process did not consider ethnic and tribal characteristics of locals on the boundaries created. Post-independence democratic politics has been mainly affected by these ethnic and tribal divisions, with many of the political establishments and voting patterns of the electorates being ethnic and tribal in nature. Countries that are yet to engage in an inclusive constitutional convention post-independence with the intention of creating their own versions of democracy that ensures ethnic and tribal coexistence, inclusivity in governance and accommodation of varying interest are still heavily affected by this situation. The second challenge comes from the previous ratio of minority white governments to the majority blacks that were excluded from political activity. The incoming black governments inherited a state apparatus designed to provide a high standard of living to a few connected individuals out of race privileges, thus closing the gap has been difficult and problematic. Suddenly black majority governments were required to accommodate and provide decent living standards to a large number of people and also include them in the decision-making process with those same limited institutions. If independent nations lacked proper planning in the early years of being majority democracies, then transitional difficulties are still being experienced. African countries that attained independence through military struggles have their own unique set of challenges. Upon accession of revolutionary leaders to senior governmental roles, some have just maintained the previous oppressive governmental structures to the benefit of the few that were at the forefront of their nation's revolutionary struggle. These leaders feel entitled and justified in acquiring national resources and other privileges for themselves as rewards for the sacrifices they made in the route to the attainment of independence, making full democratic establishment difficult. In conclusion, we will compare ancient and modern democracies. To compare forms of governance systems, we analyze their levels of political legitimacy. In democracies, political legitimacy is reflected by the willingness of the population to accept the writ of the state, the decisions of the executive, legislature and the judiciary. Athenian democratic administrative decisions were initially derived from a randomized system as various people possessing various skills rotated in holding significant positions at different times. Many of Athens' learned and leading citizens were not pleased by decisions made by people they thought were lower than them on the social ladder. To control this, the democracy created a system of joint decision-making whereby different people from varying professions and fields made joint decision using clear decision tools after considering various issues. Acceptance of decisions made in this way was high for various people who were first given a chance to convince each other before decision-making rules were applied. This practice is also in line with modern corporate governance codes where board member and senior management should be from a variety of fields for sound decision-making in public institutions and entities. For judicial decisions, Athenian courts were presided over by fellow citizens in large numbers. Cases of a captured court system were remote, thus, decisions and judgments were acceptable, for even the redress itself was also derived from the litigants. On major resolutions like declaring war, raising taxes and other significant issues, assembly meetings allowed for open discussions where everyone had the right to vote, since the decision-makers were also the ones to carry out actions of agreed resolutions. Issues were also decided on an issue-by-issue basis, as opposed to the current democratic setup in which the population entrusts other entities to decide their fate as representatives for a considerable time period. In modern democracies, the people do participate in voting, but do not participate in law-making of law enforcement. Actually, in most modern democracies nobody bothers to consult them on new laws and policies. However, pressure is applied by civil society groups and the media depending on how free and independent they are in particular jurisdictions. In modern democracies, people vote to elect representatives to act as their voice, and once in power they can pretty much do whatever they want. The situation is worse in developing countries that are now accustomed to sham elections. To value the political legitimacy of modern democracies, we mainly consider the constitutional provisions available to the effect of the separation of power between the branches of government, the quality and implementation of electoral laws and independence, availability and accessibility of media houses. In the wake of the technological revolution, we also see that those with information and significant financial backing have the power to capture and influence government institutions in swaying decision in their own interests. Moving forward. In the coming chapters, one will look at Zimbabwe's own journey in its attempts on the achievement of a true and full democratic nation. I will look at our country's past political developments on an issue-by-issue basis, analyzing key variables, trends, thus proffering possible remedial and mitigations actions. Chapter 3. Voters not parties choose MPs. In the July 2013 harmonized elections, I voted under the Norton constituency in the Ward 10 Council. In the event of an election, the Zimbabwean constitution assures me the right of choice to elect any candidate, who I feel would best represent my interests in the different levels of government. In that case, the choice to elect a councillor, member of the National Assembly, and President of the Republic of Zimbabwe was offered to me. In the seat as member of the National Assembly, I voted for the ZANU-PF candidate Christopher Mustvangwa, as I considered him as a vocal and accessible to represent my views in Parliament from his characteristics of being a fearless man who stands for what is right regardless of any political party position. In the seat for the President of the Republic, I voted for the MDCT candidate the late Morgan Tsvangirai, as I felt that he had the policies to re-engage the country with the international community in terms of trade, investments and access to finance on the international markets that I viewed as paramount for the economy of Zimbabwe at that time. I was happy that I was able to achieve the desired result for the National Assembly as CDE Mustvangwa was elected, although I failed to achieve the desired result for the presidency. As I reflect on the time Mustvangwa did serve as a member of the National Assembly on my behalf and also appointed to Cabinet as Foreign Affairs Deputy Minister, he represented my interests very well that were in line with my calculations when I voted for him to the Parliament. He even stood against the political party line to which he belonged to, like in the former First Lady Grace Mugabe's United States visa to the United Nations summit issue, which I felt represented my views too. This was my choice to consider the character and principles of the candidate who I wanted to put in office regardless of their political party allegiances. To some extent, I knew that no person could have defeated the former late President R. Mugabe in that election due to the provision I seek to have removed from our current constitution. In this constitutional application, I feel that my constitutional right to make political choices freely that are assured by the Constitution under Section 67 Clause 1b, in the event of elections and the representation in Parliament by any candidate who I feel myself would best represent my interests in these houses, are being infringed upon by another provision in the same Constitution, Section 129 Clause k. This clause states that, if a member ceased to belong to the political party of which he or she was a member when elected to Parliament, and the political party concerned, by written notice to the Speaker or the President of the Senate, as the case may be, has declared that the member has ceased to belong to it, the member will be recalled from Parliament by that party. This provision simply means that for whatever political difference my preferred choice has with his political establishment, that political establishment has the right to infringe upon my right to elect any candidate to Parliament by giving the political party this right to recall members from Parliament to which in this case that political party had no influence on my decision to elect Mustvangwa. Members of Parliament are voted for by the people of a particular constituency under Section 117, who some like me don't belong to any political establishment, but are just simply rational voters who consider facts before voting for preferred candidates, not political parties. How then can a political party have the right to consider my choice as void? This is not in line with the rights assigned to me under my freedoms of association or dissociation in this Constitution. The political and democratic argument for the complete removal of Section 129 k from our Constitution starts from the principles of the state highlighted in Chapter 2, Section 8 of the Constitution, where it states, "The objectives of the chapter guide the state and all institutions and agencies of government at every level in formulating and implementing laws and policy decisions that will lead to the establishment, enhancement and promotion of a sustainable, just, free and democratic society in which people enjoy prosperous, happy and fulfilling lives." Politically, Section 129 k is a technical coup that has been used by these same political parties and their leaders to maintain a dictatorial stance to leadership, thereby affecting the principles to having sustainable, just, free and democratic institutions like the Parliament, which has a special role in ensuring good governance in our country. It is important to note that a few political parties, through top leaders at the time of drafting this constitution, were the only major players in getting it to life, although the majority of Zimbabweans just voted for it in the referendum. Looking back at how this provision has been used by these major political parties like ZANU-PF, the ruling party, and the MDC, the major opposition, the provision has been used to silence challengers to political party leadership and policies, leading us to having undemocratic political parties and also having political parties infringing our rights to making political choices freely. Our state institutions can no longer be made weak from political party disputes, which in most cases don't allow for open, free, just and democratic processes to be instituted where differences in views and policies are encompassed in their members. It is evident that all these major political parties are factional and have poor conflict resolution mechanism. The constitution and the running of government should not be affected and must not contain provisions that allow these undemocratic processes and other constitutional violations like the issue of the military coup that happened in November 2017. In my general understanding, the objective of the Constitution is to create a system of good governance where the people consciously and purposefully create a free, just and united nation, whose primary vision is on the improvement of the quality of life for everyone in Zimbabwe. To achieve this objective, a few people in the population are elected to government, who some have the duty to appoint other representatives to be the principal representatives and servants of all the people in the country because the whole population cannot be in government. The main branches are the elected and appointed executive, an elected parliament and the judiciary, which is also appointed to government. The president is the head of the state, or in other words the head of the executive, and her power is derived from the people of Zimbabwe as a whole through an election and works as our servant accordingly. The president exercises her power through appointing a cabinet which is responsible for performing her program, that is in line with the nation objective of improving the quality of life for all Zimbabweans in a sustainable, just, free and democratic manner. She has the power to hire or fire any member of parliament and 5 other persons into or out of cabinet at any moment for the fulfillment of his agenda as she sees fit. The parliament is the other legislative arm of government that must derive its mandate from us the people, and I repeat, only from us the people. In an ideal constitution it has power to ensure that the provisions of the constitution are upheld and that the state and all institutions and agencies of government at every level act constitutionally and in the national interest. Under Section 119(2), thus in Provision 3, all institutions and agencies of the state and government at every level are accountable to Parliament. These provisions clearly make all branches and institutions of government, the executive, the Parliament itself and other state institutions, to be accountable to the Parliament. The Parliament has a clear role of playing judge to every other government branch, state institution or agency as it is created by and representative of we the people of Zimbabwe. Thus, its composition should never ever be edited by any other entity or branch of government except us the people and, at the worst, the whole Parliament itself using prescribed decision-making tools. This is the ideal setup, which contains clear checks and balance for good governance and accountability that does not centralize power in one arm of government through special provisions in other areas of the Constitution. In the past and also predicatively in the immediate future, the President of Zimbabwe has and will be the leader of the political party, which has and will attain the majority of seats in both the House of National Assembly and the Senate, Parliament. As I have explained above, one of the most important functions of Parliament is to make the executive accountable. How then can Parliament fully make the executive accountable to it when the majority of its members are from the majority political party having this constitutional provision that acts as a gun on their heads? If Parliament members or councillors express a viewpoint different from the party leadership or try to make the executive accountable in Parliament, then fake charges of disloyalty followed by the recalls will be used against them, causing Parliament to fail in its oversight role. Another dangerous trend that is now developing in our political environment is the weaponization of the country's natural resources for the maintenance of political influence and control. Our Constitution and previously enacted legislation centralized the distribution of the means of production within the hands of the executive. Resources such as agricultural land, mining licenses, exclusive prospecting licenses and decisions concerning provinces and local government issues all have to first gain approval from senior executive members. When the executive branch is from a different political party orientation from that which controls the local authority or provincial council, the approval of decisions made at these local community levels will be difficult to attain. Within the same political party orientation, if local authority or provincial council decisions are different from the political party leader's directives, then recalls are also applied using this provision. In a government-forming political party, if members attempt to put the executive or senior party leaders to account on patronage issues or fight for political party leadership, we also see the weaponization of the country's natural resources as agricultural land and mining claims are withdrawn from these members due to poor security of tenure laws in the country. At the beginning of 2020, we saw ZANU-PF youth leaders in Comrade Senengani and Comrade Matutu making allegation on issues of corruption and patronage that implicated senior members of their political party. These two party members were swiftly suspended from their leadership positions with their allotted agricultural land leases withdrawn. The same goes for the former ZANU-PF political commissar Comrade Xavier Kasukaware, former Politburo member Comrade Patrick Zuwawo and many others who were on the losing side of the party's leadership battle to the current leaders. Again, we also see the weaponization of agricultural land with farm leases being withdrawn from these former members. No wonder why the country's current leaders are moving slowly on the issue of ensuring full property rights on agricultural land. In the main opposition MDC alliance, we also see the expulsions of the Masvingo, Victoria Falls and Chegutu mayors. These council members were chosen by the people of those communities and were recalled for aligning with ZANU-PF councillors on issues that would have advanced the interests of communities they represent. No wonder why now the opposition leader comments on the irrelevance of councillors and members of parliament, for most of the powers are concentrated towards top party officials and the executive branch of government under the current provisions. The use of this provision, Section 129(k), by former President Robert Mugabe ensured him ultimate power as leader of the republic and his political party ZANU-PF. Anyone who had a different view on policy, leadership of the party and the happenings in ZANU-PF would have rather kept silent or faced the axe. The only time we saw members from ZANU-PF have different views from the executive being expressed in the parliament was when a greater constitutional violation happened. In November 2017, the National Army was deployed by a commander of the army and not the commander-in-chief of the defense forces for the settlement of internal party politics. This is the reason why in recent interviews in the national press, we see and hear ZANU-PF members putting all the blame on Mugabe even for periods they were in these houses of parliament, or the executive just acting like lame ducks in the political system. In the Terence Simbi vs Tendai Biti interview, you clearly hear a ZANU-PF member trying to distance himself from the destruction and degeneration that happened in the country, placing all the blame on Mugabe. Sections 129(k) allows for an unchecked executive. The other provision that says that the vice president serve at the pleasure of the president is equally distractive. We, the rational voters, know that unchecked political power is dangerous for anyone no matter her intention on attainment of political office. Absolute power absolutely corrupts anyone. In the exercise of our voting rights, we the rational voters vote for a candidate to parliament who is from one political party and then for the executive vote for the other political party. We are trying to create a check and balancing mechanism through our voting rights. The executive will be fully accountable to a parliament that is of another party. This current constitution assumes that when you vote for a candidate, you have voted for a particular political party, which is not the case. In conclusion, the issue to consider here is whether the provisions set in Section 129(k) are consistent with the values of this Constitution. Does this provision violate other sacred rights assured to other entities in the same Constitution? Below is the list of issues to consider. 1. Is the use of Section 129(k) in violation with a constituency's electorate's rights to make political choices freely? 2. Is the provision consistent with the objectives of the state, in ensuring that the state and all institutions and agencies of government at every level formulate laws and policy decisions that lead to the establishment, enhancement and promotion of a sustainable, just, free and democratic society? 3. Does the use of this provision aid or hinder the Parliament's role of making the executive accountable to it? 4. To what extent does this provision lead to the violation of other more sacred constitutional provision like Section 213? Chapter 4. ZIDRA 2018 Amendment Act, what does that mean for Zimbabwe? In 2016, I completed my undergraduate studies and thus attained a bachelor's degree in applied accounting. The process towards attaining this qualification involved completing a research report and most importantly, writing what is known as the Skills and Learning Statement, SLS. In this article, I am going to focus mainly on the Skills and Learning Statement, as in my view, The characteristics and processes involved in completing this document are the ones captured in the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, ZIDRA, S494, of 2001 and subsequent 2018 amendments, passed by the United States Congress. The Skills and Learning Statement is basically a statement of self-reflection, where one will be required to recall the processes conducted whilst completing the research project. The statement questions are designed for one to be his or her own judge through imparting this key graduate skill of self-reflection. The first question is on how well one thinks they have met the objectives they, themselves had initially set at the beginning of the research project. The next question will require one to reflect on the business models used on the research project and how these have helped one in meeting the research objectives set. The other questions are designed to demonstrate another key graduate skill, effective communication, where one reflects on the project presentation, communication, and the information gathering methods used. The last question is there for one to reflect on the overall research process, giving one time to project how this process would be helpful in future roles and projects. On the backdrop of explaining the characteristics of the Skills and Learning Statement, the question is, does the ZIDRA Act mean sanctions to the nation of Zimbabwe? Before answering this question in technical terms, let me use the real friend story below to explain some simple, but fundamental principles of friendship. Once upon a time, they were two friends. The first friend, Uja, was slightly well-to-do and mature as compared to his colleague, Zame. Zame had great potential for success as he had just been out of college where he had attained all the necessary skills. They all had families that were standard, and in the course of their friendship, they occasionally went out to have a couple of drinks together. In the course of time, Zame started to show some strange behavioral changes. He started borrowing money from Uja, and at the beginning in small amounts for what seemed to be good intentions, and paid back these funds in good time. Suddenly, the amounts being borrowed got larger and their repayments delayed. Then, at the last instance of note, Zame failed to pay back Uja the amount borrowed. Uja then did his own research on the happenings in Zame's life and discovered some shocking developments. Zame now had 2 extramarital affairs. Reports further said that he at times failed to pay bills at his official home, delayed the payment of school fees for his children, and often went for days without going back home to his wife. The next time when Zame approached Uja to get a loan extension, the latter turned him away, saying that he wasn't able to extend any additional finance owing to his household mismanagement findings. To add on to this, Uja told Zame that he had also told all his other friends with money not to extend any form of financial assistance to him until he reformed his ways. Zame was much aggrieved by this and hated Uja. In the course of time, Zame then found another friend, Kian, who was a rival to Uja, but who was also well-to-do. Kian seemed not much concerned about the affairs of Zame's household, so he extended loans to him which he expected to be paid back in good time. In the course of time, Kian then found a gap in the household of Zame where at most times the latter would be away with some of his extramarital affairs. Kian found ways to be with Zame's wife unnoticeable. The end. In Zimbabwe, a great part of the population is exploited to certain opinions and perceptions on political and international matters by political actors owing to lack of general civic education. I estimate that 90%, if not 98% of Zimbabweans are yet to read the Constitution of the land or the ZIDRA Act, but have perceptions and opinions about these documents fed to them by either newspapers or political actors who have vested, but sinister interests in these matters. The ability to form personal opinions about these key issues that affect our country is thus lost to these political actors, and for our country, mainly to lawyers and securocrats whom constitute a greater proportion of political formation membership. The law profession can argue some narrow and weak positions on grievances on either technicality, procedural or precedent rulings, thus win with those weak positions. The problem is that the profession belongs to a non-productive sector. We are now in a situation where it's just political argument after argument with nothing being achieved and produced in the country. The general population has been turned into political victims, subject to rising poverty level as the country has consistently been in a state of a political courtroom. According to my own interpretation of the ZIDRA Act 2001, the issues highlighted were that of a friend concerned with the affairs of a peer whose democratic and governance conduct was rapidly deteriorating. Issues cited in the act included the economic mismanagement of the then government, the breakdown in the rule of law, undemocratic practices that were on the rise, inability of the country to meet international lending organizations' loan repayment terms, lack of respect to ownership and title of property, costly deployment of troops to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the involvement of the military in domestic affairs. In my view, these concerns were genuine, for they required us as Zimbabweans to look internally at how our own previous aspirations and objectives stated in all of our governance and economic blueprints adopted since independence had fared, using the principles of the skill and learning statement I alluded to at the beginning of the article. Zimbabwe has had the following economic blueprints since independence: 1980-81 Growth with Equity, 1982-1985 Transitional National Development Plan, 1986-90 National Development Plan, 1991-95 Economic Structural Adjustment Plan, ESAP, 1996-2000 Zimbabwe Program for Economic and Social Transformation, ZIMPREST, 2001-2002 Millennium Economic Recovery Program, MERP, 2003-2006 National Economic Revival Program, NERP, 2007 National Economic Development Priority Program, NEDPP, 2008 Zimbabwe Economic Development Strategy, ZEDS, 2009, Short-Term Emergency Recovery Program, STERP, 2010-12, STERP-2, 2013-18 Zimbabwe Agenda for Sustainable Socio-Economic Transformation, ZIMASET, and now, the Zimbabwe is open for business mantra. All these policies have been adopted one after the other without careful insight and self-reflection on how the previous policy had fared. It is always natural for one to hate and label those that come with good advice and thus find a strong counter-argument against them, especially if the recipient of the advice is in the law profession. The then ZANU-PF-led government, with a strong war veteran representation counter-argument to the ZIDRA Act, was that the law had been designed to reverse the land reform program. As I will explain below, the then land reform program had been implemented in a reactionary fast-track pace since the June 2000 period to the law enactment period. Due to this counter-argument, the other circumstantial events and trends that culminated in the act have now been forgotten, leaving Zimbabwean policy formulators and the nation's political actors to miss out on the opportunity to self-reflect and get lessons of worth for future policy formulation and implementation strategies. That is typical behavior for persons in the law profession, for it is designed to fight and move from one case to the next, only looking back to see if there were cases of precedence to apply to the current case. This is opposed to the principles of my profession, which looks back to analyze trends and the circumstances that surrounded them, whether they be favorable or unfavorable, but with the aim of finding solutions for future trends. Let me now put things into context and thus briefly highlight some of the other variables present in the period preceding the enactment of this law. I will not deal much with issues to do with economic mismanagement, as these are already covered in my book The Next Zimbabwe, in Chapter 2 titled The Old and New Economy. I will start with the economic challenges that were now present in the country at the beginning of 1997, where they were rising food prices, fuel shortages, rising levels of unemployment and discontent in the population shown by the rise of civil disobedience through countrywide strikes. The critical bones of contentions came from the war veterans, who felt greatly excluded from economic activity and a feeling of betrayal by the then government on the land reform issue. The government had moved at a slow pace under the willing buyer willing seller arrangement of the then constitution. Another critical issue was of the abuse of funds under the War Victims' Compensation Act of 1993, where the Chidyazaku Commission report of August 1997 pointed to major payouts going to senior ZANU-PF officials. The stage was set for a major confrontation between ZANU-PF and the War Veterans Association, thus the then president had to act. In September 1997, all veterans were given a payout of $50,000 in an attempt to silence them, but two critical trends emerged from there. The economic trend of the country worsened since these funds were not economically backed in any form, thus the inflation rate spiraled. The second critical trend was the empowerment of the War Veterans Association that resulted in it strongly affecting government policy up to today. If self-reflection had taken place following the Chidyazaku report, a reform process would have helped to stamp out corruption in ZANU-PF and government, realign the economic trajectory of the country and most importantly produce reforms that would have expedited land reform. However, a reactionary, quick but dangerous solution was applied that protected the party and war veterans' interests at the expense of the nation. In the same 1997, civil society groups organized themselves along the National Constitutional Assembly, NCA, demanding economic, social and political reforms including advocating for a new constitution. Despite all these domestic pressures, in June 1998 the government sent the first group of 11,000 soldiers to the Democratic Republic of Congo to help President Laurent Kabila fight off rebels in his country. This is also highlighted by the Zidara Act as a major area of concern requiring self-reflection. Let me now fast forward to this year where the Zidara Amendment Act was passed on August 6, 2018. The questions are what clauses have changed, which clauses have been added and what do all these amendments mean for the nation of Zimbabwe? In general, the 2018 amendments are meant for all Zimbabwean political players to conduct a broad-based self-reflection process just as the initial 2001 Act had recommended. Now on the clauses that have changed, firstly, there has been the removal of the costly deployment of troops to the DRC replaced by the line pointing to the private appropriation of public assets. The amendment appreciates that in October 2016 the Zimbabwean government cleared its long-standing arrears with the IMF and issues to do with the land reform program were removed from the act. The biggest changes came on election and pre-election conditions, with the amendment touching on the voters' role by asking for the biometric digital and paper format to be released to the public without cost before any poll and calls for measures to ensure the independence of the Electoral Management Board. The act highlights the need for the Zimbabwe Defense Forces to neither be involved in the election process in whatever form and for candidates competing in an election to be allowed full and equal access to state media. The new issues in the amendments to which I will expagorate further below are on updating all statutes that are not compliant with the 2013 Zimbabwean Constitution. Calls are also made for government to uphold major elements of the 2013 Constitution like on devolution, human rights and freedoms of citizens guaranteed by it. The Act also calls on diamond revenue to be accounted for and immediate actions be taken to unify the people of Zimbabwe as evident in the 2018 election result on how divided the country is and lastly, calls on the government to enforce the SADC tribunal ruling of 2007 to 2010 regarding disputes on employment and human rights cases when dispossessing commercial farmers and agricultural companies. The first critical issue for us to address is on the updating of all prior statutes for them to comply with the 2013 Constitution. On this issue let me take us back to the problems of 1997 where a critical group in our population, the war veterans, felt a trend of being excluded from economic activities and had public property and benefits due to them being appropriated to private use by government officials. The same exclusion and exploitation feelings then are the same feeling being felt by the majority of Zimbabwean youths today. These feelings showcased themselves on August 1, 2018 in Harare. Due to frustrations of desired election results and a situation of delay in result announcement, the youth showed their anger and need to be included in economic activities in violent ways. The major problem on this day was the reaction of the government as it used a statute that is not consistent and compliant with the Constitution of 2013, hence deployed the military using the POSA, Public Order and Security Act. The POSA, Section 37 clause used to deploy the military through a request by the Commissioner of the Police and approval made by the Home Affairs Minister without the approval of the President as seen from the initial findings. This procedure is not in line with the Constitution. This trend of deploying the military without the President's authority had its original sin in November 2017 and now developing into a trend to which we have to find atonement before this violation persists and causes other major tragedies in future. I have heard various interpretations from lawyers representing ZANU-PF. the advocate Chinyoka argument that says because the MDC endorsed deployment under Restore Legacy, henceforth deployment without the Commander-in-Chief on August 1, 2018 is then justified. One high-profile example is from advocate Louis Uriari, who defended ZANU-PF and the president so dearly on the MDC alliance election challenge at the Constitutional Court because his meal came from ZANU-PF on that day. Just a week after defending ZANU-PF, Uriari was in court again, but now defending Professor Levi Nyagura of the University of Zimbabwe against the president. The arguments were now against the president for appointing the Anti-Corruption Commission and Commission to investigate the post-election violence without an act of parliament, as his meal now came from Nyagura. Let me now step into the law profession for a while. The 2013 Constitution clearly states that the deployment of the military is guided under Section 213, 1, and 2. The section says only the Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces has power to authorize the deployment of the military and power to determine the operational use of the military. Under Clause 2, it says with the authority of the President the Defense Forces may be deployed in Zimbabwe, a. in defense of Zimbabwe, b. in support of the police service to maintain public order, and c. other civilian authorities in the event of an emergency or disaster. The other instance of deployment is through a two-thirds majority vote of the total National Assembly. To have a clear understanding of how consistent the Constitution places this responsibility to the deployment of the military on the President's hands, and only the President, is when you review Section 100. Section 100 is generally centered on persons who are given authority to act in capacity of the President, acting presidents, when he/she is away. The section clearly states that these persons have all other power of the President except powers, a. to deploy the military, b. enter into any international convention, treaty, or agreement, c. to appoint or revoke appointment of a vice president, minister or deputy minister, and d. reassign or assign members of the executive or the administration of any act of parliament. The sin of November 2017 was further exacerbated by a dangerous precedent set from the ruling made by the other arm of government, the judiciary, in a ruling made by Judge President Justice Chiwesh, in a petition brought to the High Court by parliamentarians Joseph Evurath Sibanda and Leonard Chikamba, who argued that the military intervention was constitutional. In the judgment, Justice Chiwesh said that the intervention was necessary to stop the elected first respondent's constitutional function, seeing that his duties were now being influenced by those around him, who were not elected using Section 212. The judgment gave the second respondent the right to act in the manner that allowed him to deploy the military without orders from the Commander-in-Chief. This judgment has created an unfavorable trend through this precedent ruling, and issues surrounding this must be dealt with immediately. The issue of setting up a commission of inquiry with foreign representatives is another waste of resources, as this will not achieve anything concrete, as this is just a show to the international community that something is being done. Rather, an internal process with all of Zimbabwe's political and civil society players must be conducted with a common objective of self-reflection. This waste continued with the opposition MDC alliance hiring lawyers from South Africa and Nigeria to be their representatives in their constitutional court application. Why and how do we continue to spend these little resources we currently have on things we already have capacity to conduct for ourselves? In my previous opinion writings, I have always been of the view that the November 2017 sin could have been circumvented by removing two clauses from our current constitution. The President is aware of these clauses, as these were used against him before by the former President. At an election rally before the recent polls, the President points to these tools as he said, "I am aware of plans within my party ZANU-PF that when I resoundingly win the presidential and parliamentary election, some members want to remove me using the impeachment mechanism. However, our Constitution has tools that when we see that you are no longer a member of our party, we have that right to chase you out of the party and parliament altogether." Literally speaking, the first tool is Section 129(k), and the other is the clause that says the Vice President serves at the pleasure of the President. The other two major issues highlighted by Zidera 2018, to which I will combine in my explanation, is that of government implementing commitments of the 2013 Constitution like devolution. The other is on the government taking immediate actions to unify the politically divided country. On these issues, I am very aware of the President's comments born from instincts of being a lawyer and thus use precedents. The President refers to the case of former British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who won the British election of 1964 by just 4 seats. Wilson formed a government without the opposition. Here is just another case of how lawyers make decisions. The President and ZANU-PF are yet to look back through a process of broad-based political self-reflection establishing trends on how this politically polarized situation has fared for Zimbabwe over the last 20 years. Never mind the intentions of the President on progressing this country. If no self-reflection and attempts to unify the nation are done urgently, the same old divisional challenges will continue to haunt us. On the issue of devolution, just observing the distribution of the final election tallies and ministerial appointment, especially on the provincial ministry appointments, challenges arising from recent history will continue to persist on this issue. In all the major cities, the likes of Harare, Bulawayo, or even Mutare, the opposition MDC alliance got most of the votes in these cities and provinces. In an ideal devolution setup, the opposition has the mandate to control and influence the direction of resources in those critical provinces. The worrisome part about provincial ministerial appointments made by the President are attempts by the ZANU-PF-led government to maintain control in places that it has no mandate by saying that the appointed provincial ministers will now exercise executive powers on elected provincial councils. This is total rubbish, for we can reflect on the recent chaos in Harare where former town clerks like Mushor and Nkyub had executive powers exercised on them, thus had their tenure revoked by the executive, not the elected power of that area. The power to make appointment and revoke appointment of these key positions lay in another ministry called local government that might be occupied by sometimes elected individual, yes, but the member might not be from that area. If the bill governing devolution is not born from a broad-based consultative process and the ZANU-PF majority parliament passes the bill without the opposition input, the same problems of yesterday will continue to exist. The other issues requiring self-reflection cited in Zidra are on human rights violations in the Gukurahundi and Murambatsvina events, to which I will not explain much. The importance of the Murambatsvina review is to assist with the current issue where the government is trying to clean up our major cities that are now in a bad state. The Gukurahundi self-reflection will assist the nation to heal on grievances that lay in the various tribes of Zimbabwe. Reviewing Zidra has importantly highlighted to me how and why other countries achieve so much and continue to be successful in their agreed policy programs. You can really see the level of honesty in the processes evident in the information gathering methods used and issues cited in the initial and subsequent Zidra Act. What really got me inspired was the self-reflection process the Americans conducted, expressed in the amendment of 2018. Variable and circumstances that had changed in the Zimbabwean context we acknowledged, with some being removed for that policy. The variables and circumstances that arose between the 17 years had to be added to the Act, all in an attempt to aid us Zimbabweans to conduct our own honest broad-based self-reflection process. The United States process involved senators meeting with the country's opposition after the November 2017 events, various visits to the country prior and during the election before the final bill and act being passed by President Trump. White people know that we African people always like to lie to ourselves and exercise wishful thinking in our conduct. So, I will end with words from former South African President under apartheid rule P.W. Botha to his cabinet in 1985, and I quote, "We are not obliged even the least to try prove to anybody and to the blacks that we are superior people. We have demonstrated that to the blacks in 1001 ways. The Republic of South Africa that we know of today has not been created by wishful thinking. We have created it at the expense of intelligence, sweat and blood. We do not pretend like other whites that we like the blacks. The fact that blacks look like human beings and act like human beings do not necessarily make them sensible human beings. Hedgehogs are not porcupines and lizards are not crocodiles because they look alike. If God had wanted us to be equal to the blacks, He would have created us all of a uniform color and intellect. But He created us differently, whites, blacks, yellow, rulers and the ruled. Intellectually, we are superior to the blacks, that has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt over the years. I believe that the Afrikaner, Boer, is honest, God-fearing person, who has demonstrated practically the right way of being. By now every one of us has seen it practically that the blacks cannot rule themselves. Give them guns and they will kill each other. They are good in nothing else but making noise, dancing, marrying many wives and indulging in sex. Let us all accept that the black man is a symbol of poverty, mental inferiority, laziness and emotional incompetence. Isn't it plausible? Therefore, that the white man is created to rule the black man, and here is a creature, black man, that lacks foresight. The average black does not plan his life beyond a year. Chapter 5. The Zimbabwean Dream. This is an article I wrote a day before the election of the 30th of July 2018. I had to reflect on it again months later, just after the Cyclone Idai disaster that affected the eastern highlands areas of the country. The Zimbabwean Dream was the major issue of the 30th of July 2018 election, as this was highlighted by all the major political party campaigns. In the article I focused on three distinct but significant political campaign views of this Zimbabwean dream, their mind-setting effects and fulfillment requirements. I started first by apologizing to those political parties to which I did not take time to analyze their political campaign views of this Zimbabwean dream. I felt that although we now have many political parties and views of this Zimbabwean dream, in essence all these views are fundamentally similar. I integrated the MDC Alliance, Nelson Chamisa, APA, Nkosana Moyo and ZANU, PF, Emerson Mnangagwa's vision of this ideal Zimbabwe into one, as I believed and still believe that these are all in union, vital for the country to move forward. Why say all in union? Yes, all in union because the agendas and aspirations of these political parties and campaign views capture the three stages required in the development of a prosperous nation. The first campaign represented the future, with it what can be achieved, then the next representing the present, with it what should be done, with the last representing the past, with it lessons of worth. After reviewing these three election manifestos, I truly believed and up to now still believe that they were all in essence similar in their key fundamental areas like land title, agricultural investment, international community re-engagement, the fight against corruption, mining, tourism and the need to retool and expand our production industries. Now that being said, there were some key issues that were captured by these three campaigns which are worth noting as key attributes needed in harnessing this great Zimbabwean dream. The Nelson Chamisa campaign came with the imagination and vision for a nation which is naturally resourced like Zimbabwe. With Zimbabwe's wealth of educated, talented and gifted population, the campaign possessed a dream on how far we can go to build a modern state. Many people castigated Chamisa for this mind-changing and futuristic campaign, saying that this vision was pure nonsense. The most notable international critic was the British hard-talk journalist Stephen Sacker. We might have been a colony of the British, but we are no longer bound by their idealism. Britain is a country that was built decades if not centuries ago, and we are at different stages of our development. By God's grace, I had the opportunity in February last year to visit the United Arab Emirates city of Dubai. Dubai is a land built out of dreams where 20 years ago it was just a pile of sand. The principle in Dubai is that the crazier the proposed project is, the more likely this crazy proposal will be built. There is no room for mediocrity and ordinary thoughts, and Zimbabwe, aiming to be the leading nation in Africa, has to possess these attributes to realize this dream. What was ironic about the UAE was that it only has two major resources in crude oil and sand. The UAE's crude oil is estimated to be exhausted by the year 2023. Seeing the figures, its leadership made long-term strategic plans to transform the economy years ago to be the hub for international commerce, trade and tourism. The country then built mega shopping malls, futurist hotels and sporting facilities. The city also engineered artificial islands to add to its coastline and constructed a state-of-the-art transport network. These entire investments were made in order to transform their economy to be tourism and commerce-based. Zimbabwe is in a unique position as it does not only have two major resources but an abundant number. Zimbabwe henceforth can strategically design its economy to be based on a number of sectors. Our liberation struggle was mainly aimed at reversing ownership to the means of production, i.e. the land, the mines, and removal of segregation laws. We have moved on from this stage now, as the land is now in the hands of us, the black majority, and the companies are also now possessed by us, the black population. The problem with this repossession phase we had, especially in terms of companies taken using the indigenization law, is the difficulty of managing something you did not create or build. No matter how professional or educated a population might be, things that you just possess or inherit without any effort led to this situation where we no longer maintain our road networks. The repossessed companies have crumbled and the productivity on those possessed farms is ever low. This is so because of the lack of value we place on these farms, farm equipment, companies, and inherited infrastructure. In recent years, the Joina City building was opened in Harare. Although the country is still experiencing economic difficulties, there is a different level of value placed around and within the building. People make it a point to dress well around that area because it is the symbol of this generation, not a product of the repossession phrase. This was the symbol of the Nelson Chamisa campaign, as it looked ahead on creation and modernizing our country. The APA, Nkosana Moyo, possessed key issues needed in our governance structures in terms of promoting accountability, the separation of powers between the executive, the House of Assembly, and the judiciary. It might be that Dr. Moyo has a banking background. One of the key fundamental functions of a banker before investing in a client is the assessment of governance structures of the applicant's organization, institution, or country. The current Zimbabwean constitution has with it some simple clauses that prevent this level of accountability and good governance required in harnessing this great Zimbabwean dream. Dr. Moyo highlighted and made proposals to amend these provisions in his campaigns. In my previous chapters, one also deal with some of these provisions by asking for the repeal of Section 129 Clause K, and adoption of checks and balances in our Constitution to enhance good governance and accountability. There was no doubt that after the 30th of July election and now after this national disaster with a drought facing the nation, Zimbabwe has to engage international money lenders for capital to finance its economic sustenance and recovery programs. International money lenders, before lending money to countries or companies within our country, use rating agencies like Standard & Poor's and Fitch Ratings. These agencies use models which take into account a country's governance structures, assessing accountability levels, institutional independency, and political stability. These assessments affect interest rates as the government and our companies apply for international loans that are badly required in rebuilding and modernize our country. The principle is that, when a country has been rated at a certain level, therefore no company operating within it can access international loans possessing ratings better than the country's own. South Africa 3 years ago faced a similar situation when it had its credit rating downgraded to junk status owing to the state capture scandal. To have this system removed, several votes of no confidence in the president were initiated in their parliament. In the last case, a secret ballot voting system was applied where individuals within the ruling ANC then refused to be part of this patronage system by voting against Jacob Zuma, their former president. In the Supreme Court opinion on the secret ballot matter, you clearly hear this issue on the separation of power being reiterated as control measures for effective governance. Many local legal experts have expressed reservation in amending our constitution so early after adoption. It is important to note that the leading and founding democracy, the United States of America, made its first 10 amendments within the first 4 years of adoption their constitution. When a system of governance is not working, we should not be limited in perfecting it to thus prevent events like the military coup that we experienced in November 2017. Now, the last campaign of significance for the Zimbabwean dream in last year's election was the Emmerson Mnangagwa ZANU-PF campaign. In my introduction I said that it was a campaign that represented the past, with its lesson of worth. There is nothing that illustrates this more like the story he told his followers at the beginning of his election campaign. The president spoke of an experience in the early years of the liberation struggle of him and other freedom fighters whilst they were at Mashoko, a village in Masvingo. The president recalled a Rhodesian military plane flying past where they were addressing some members of the community on their decision to fight the white settlers. One of the villagers became skeptical about the abilities of these freedom fighters. He recalled him saying, "You being down here, want to fight the white soldiers who fly up there?" The president at this campaign event went on to say, "They will always be skeptics in our own abilities, but unity and only unity was the quality that led to success during the liberation struggle." Initially, due to this level of skepticism, our freedom fighters operated apart from the villagers and communities. After receiving their training from their bases in Mozambique and Zambia, they faced challenges in re-entering the country due to this situation. The fact that the freedom fighters' operations were not coordinated with communities, some member of the community sold out on them, hence many of the early attacks were unsuccessful. The liberation struggle changed fortunes in favor of the freedom fighters when the strategy changed. This was owing to the Chinese's Mao training extended to them by China. The principle was to unite the communities and the freedom fighters to work together. This was achieved through training the communities on the importance of the liberation struggle and the importance of the community's support in the operations of the freedom fighters. These changes you can validate impact from archived tapes of interviews of the former Rhodesian head of intelligence Ken Flower. Flower is quoted, "Suddenly information coming through our intelligence channels became dry and we suddenly faced massive losses." The attacks launched by the freedom fighters became ever more successful, leading to significant victories on their side. This was so because the community and the liberation fighters worked together. The liberation struggle and victory that seemed so impossible at the beginning became ever more achievable and freedom attainable. Our beloved country has faced a similar problem over the last 20 years, but being political in nature. This is a situation where two major political parties have fought fiercely to take control of total political power. These last 20 years have been characterized by political party representatives having good policies and programs for their constitutions or provinces, but the others being forced by political ambition to fight these, using in some cases destructive strategies that led to disunity in the population. The only exception was the unity government periods. I hope that a strategic shift like the change in strategy that happened during the liberation struggle, where the freedom fighter and the community decided to work together, will prevail. I am very aware that the population of Zimbabwe is massively divided along these political party lines, but however, with all the political changes the country has experienced since November 2017, there seemed to be light at the end of the tunnel. Clearly, the objectives and proposed policies of our political parties have never been so similar. I also believe that for the challenges that lay ahead, no single political organizations will be able to navigate them alone, considering our recent political history. Most of the issues require a united front, considering the divide in our population. Some of the issues include the reintroduction of the Zimbabwean dollars, this current national disaster, the drought facing the country, and re-entry of the country into international community. In conclusion, I could have focused on weakness of these campaigns and organizations, for all of them do have significant flaws. The phenomenal where they all unite together to tackle our problems will eclipse all of these flaws. Chapter 6. Post-election violence and killings, August 1, 2018. Following a relatively peaceful voting process that was conducted on the 30th of July 2018, 2 days later violent protests broke out in the streets of Harare over delays in the announcement of election results. The Zimbabwe National Army, ZNA, was deployed to the street, indiscriminately shooting and assaulting civilians. 6 people died from gunshot wounds and many others were injured on this day. The 1st of August 2018 killings raised 3 critical issues in what were the circumstances that led to the post-election violence, who were responsible for the killings, and what can be done to avert future incidences of such a nature. On answering the question on who were responsible for the killings on the day, the answer is very simple: it is all of us Zimbabweans. We are all responsible for the deaths to our fellow countrymen. As a nation, we all have to come to terms with this truth for us to heal, find ways to reform our laws, thus prevent future incidences of such a nature from happening. Let me now explain how we all contributed to the deaths of our fellow countrymen. For this, Let us go back in history to the incidences of the smart coup in November 2017, Operation Restore Legacy, as the events of the 1st of August 2018 cannot be viewed in isolation. In my previous chapters, one referred to Operation Restore Legacy as the original sin. In the operation, the commander of the defense forces was the one who deployed the national army, not the commander-in-chief. In the actual chain of command, this meant that an individual who is number 3 in the chain deployed the national army against number 1, kidnapping then former President R.G. Mugabe, who was the commander-in-chief for days until his resignation. On the 1st of August 2018, the same individual repeated deployment, but for this incident he was now number 2 in the chain of command. The vice president, who was also the Minister of Defense, Dr. C. Chiwenga, then had the backing of a flawed act, the Public Order and Security Act, POSA, that is not consistent with the Zimbabwe Constitution of 2013. Roles and reactions of different political actors to Operation Restore Legacy. 1. The Opposition MDC Alliance. It is my belief that one of the most crucial roles played by an opposition political party in a democratic nation is that of ensuring constitutionalism and democratic practices are maintained by the governing parties. The MDC Alliance did not act in this way in the wake of Operation Restore Legacy. The political party failed to defend one of the most sacrosanct clauses enshrined in the Constitution of 2013. The Constitution emphasizes that the national army can only be deployed by the commander-in-chief, who is also the president of the land. Vice presidents or any other cabinet ministers who might act in the capacity of the president under our Constitution Section 100 don't individually have the powers on deploying the national army. Advocate Nelson Chamisa's submission to the Post-Election Violence Commission on the 26th of November 2018 said, the MDC's participation for Operation Restore Legacy was about the right to vote. Up to today, I don't really understand what he meant by that, for a clear constitutional violation happened in plain view of the MDC, to which now they complain for the events of August 2018. On many occasions the MDC has acted in this way of just going with the wind and being used by ZANU-PF because of its unstrategic and unprincipled tendencies. In their submission to the Commission they went on to say, to violate this sacrosanct constitutional provision their leadership had received promises from some ZANU-PF officials, the likes of Victor Madamadanda, to help vote with them against Mugabe in the planned impeachment vote. In the end, the impeachment vote did not materialize as Mugabe resigned, leaving ZANU-PF with no obligations towards MDC. The party had also been used in the marches to State House in the same operation, and in the end the party found itself dumped on the issue of forming a transitional authority as ZANU-PF formed the government alone. What was sad was that the opposition political party had been used to violate these constitutional clauses. 2. The judiciary. This is the other arm of our governance system that is tasked with the enforcement of laws through making sound, just and proper interpretation of the Constitution. In a petition brought to the High Court by parliamentarians Joseph Evurath Sibanda and Leonard Chikamba arguing that the military intervention was constitutional, Justice Chiwesh made a bizarre judgment that validated this constitutional violation. In the judgment, Justice Chiwesh said that the intervention was necessary to stop the elected first respondent's former President R.G. Mugabe's constitutional function, seeing that his duties were now being influenced by those around him, who were not elected using Section 212. The judgment gave the second respondent Army Commander Dr. C. Chiwenga the right to act in the manner that allowed him to deploy the army without orders from the Commander-in-Chief. This judgment has created an unfavorable trend through this precedent ruling that is also not consistent with the Constitution. Dua Mavinga, the Southern African Director in the African Division of Human Rights Watch, in his submissions to the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations on December 13, 2017 says, whatever the merits of the ruling, the judgment could embolden the military to carry further incursions in Zimbabwe's political or electoral affairs in the future. In the submission, Mavinga both warned and prophesied on the implications created by the judgment legitimizing Operation Restore Legacy in late December 2017. It was no surprise that just 5 days after these incidences on the 1st of August the United States Senate voted in favor of renewing and updating the ZITRA sanctions bill, citing inconsistencies and the use of prior laws by the Zimbabwean government that are not consistent with the Constitution of 2013. 3. The ruling party ZANU-PF. The party was for a long time entrenched in a bitter internal political struggle over leadership positions post the Mugabe era. The party had for a number of years failed to institute a clear succession plan with clear democratic processes to be followed for the replacement of their ailing leader. On this same issue, the main opposition MDC is equally liable for having vague guidelines and processes for leadership replacement. All these political organizations need to sit down now, to agree and formulate clear democratic processes for leadership replacement and political contestation for their political parties to survive the next round of changes. We can no longer have the military settling leadership disputes mainly in ZANU-PF. The MDC cannot also any longer have its leaders being installed from the preference of former leaders. The Post-Election Violence Commission was fortunate to be chaired by former South African President Kgalema Motlanthe, who also at some point stood unsuccessfully for the top leadership post as president of the ruling ANC. This is what it means to have clear procedures for contestation within a political party. Although Motlanthe lost the party leadership position, the ANC remained united. The ANC also recently had a contest between the current South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. A hard-fought internal battle on policy and a leadership debate within the political party was conducted that was free and fair on all candidates. In the end, the ANC remained united with the rivals now reconciled, thus working together in the new South African administration. The other factors that hinder democratic practices in our country's political institutions are vague and undemocratic constitutional provisions like the Section 129(k) recall provisions and provision of the vice presidents serving at the pleasure of the president. These constitutional provisions have been used to silence and suppress challengers to policy within political party and for the elimination of contenders to top leadership posts by incumbent leaders. 4. The ordinary Zimbabweans. Ordinary Zimbabweans are also implicated for participating in the illegal marches and praising of these unlawful actions. In review of all these inconsistent laws and precedent rulings, the National Army of Zimbabwe can now be deployed by 3 individuals under the chain of command without notifying the other parties in the same chain. These circumstances and individuals are: A. The President, as the Commander-in-Chief under the Constitution of 2013. B. The Defense Minister, under Section 37 of the Public Order and Security Act. C. The Commander of the Defense Forces, backed by a precedent ruling by Justice Chiwesh on Operation Restore Legacy and Section 212 of the Constitution of 2013. The critical issue in any professional security sector organization is command. Security agents are trained to execute commands that define the mission and limitations of action to be applied in its execution by their commanders. The fault of an individual soldier, policeman or any other security agent lies in the commanders. On all deployments, the operational guidelines have to be defined by the commanding officers. If any security violation is committed by a security agent, the commanding officers are the ones who are responsible and accountable for these actions. For these reasons, it's extremely important to have a well-defined chain of command for all security organs of the state. To conclude, we now know that we all acted irrationally and emotionally in sowing the seeds that produced these inconsistencies to the deployment of our national army. We now have to find ways to forgive each other as a nation, reform the laws to remove these inconsistencies, console the bereaved families and find ways to heal the nation and forge ahead as a united front. Other circumstances leading up to Operation Restore Legacy. A. Gukurahundi. Our nation has traditionally not been run as a democratic, equal and just society for a long time. We can trace these oppressive tendencies to the colonial days, especially on how the nation was run during the administration of Ian Smith before the attainment of independence. The same state security apparatus that was used to control the majority black population by the white settlers was the one inherited by the administration of the then Prime Minister R. G. Mugabe, who became president later on. The state security apparatus inherited by Mugabe was crucial on how this country has maintained its territorial integrity to this day. I will now comment on an issue that happened long before I was born purely from a historical perspective, that is the Gukurahundi issue. As a nation we have abstained from this crucial subject, thus assigned sole blame to these events on former President R.G. Mugabe. I will try to highlight some of the other factors that President Mugabe had to consider in the formulation of decisions on the dissident situation in Matabeleland and the ethnic rivalry created. During the liberation struggle, the fighting forces ZIPRA and ZANLA with their political organization ZAPU and ZANU respectively had their membership mainly based on ethnic groupings which are the Ndebele and Shona tribes respectively. The union between the ZIPRA and ZANLA commanders from the onset was shaky whilst operating from a single base in Zambia. These tensions led the ZANLA fighting force to relocate to Mozambique to lessen conflicts. Towards the end of the liberation struggle, the ZANLA and ZIPRA forces again united under a single command fighting force known as the Patriotic Front. Their respective political organizations ZAPU and ZANU also merged to participate in the Lancaster House Conference as a united front. When the Lancaster House Agreement had been secured and election date set, issues to do with leadership positions came to play. The questions were: does the Patriotic Front present a single candidate to represent them in the independence election, and most importantly, who between Komu and Mugabe was to be that candidate? Due to these issues and tribal divide, the Patriotic Front had to demerge to thus contest each other as individual parties in the independence election. The split gave the Shona-supported ZANU party election victory, as the Zimbabwean population was dominated by the Shona tribe, since the Ndebele tribe constituted around 17% of the population of the country back then. The voting patterns were mainly tribal in nature. In the infant stage of the administration of Zimbabwe, Mugabe had to deal with the serious issue of building a national army through integrating various elements. This new national army was to be constituted by ex-guerrilla forces from these black political organizations integrated with the conventional Rhodesian army. Integrating the national army involved decisions on merging three diverse armed groups that were the ZIPRA, ZAPU, element, ZANLA, ZANU, element, and finally the conventional Rhodesian army element into one army loyal to one commander-in-chief Mugabe. The main options for Mugabe were whether to 1. Create one national army that he had full command as commander-in-chief by deliberately removing ethnic lines through assigning command duties to his own ex-ZANLA commanders over the entire national army. 2. Agree in principle that the national army is one but maintain ethnic lines whilst assigning these elements to be in charge of the defense of certain territorial lines based on ethnic boundary lines within the country. These two major options had their own advantages and drawbacks considering the infancy of the nation and how armed all these elements were in the early years of independence. The first option, which President Mugabe then took, meant that he was now truly the commander-in-chief of the whole national army, but risked a backlash from ex-ZIPRA elements, for he had to assign ex-ZANLA commanders on military battalions that were mainly ex-ZIPRA. In this option he risked having ex-ZIPRA loyal elements being turned into dissidents, and surely this happened with time. The second option was aimed at maintaining the peace between the various elements within the national army. The major risk for Mugabe that I liken to the current situation we are having as a nation from the November coup and 1st of August killings is that of having multiple deployment command centers within one national army, especially back then when we were still an infant state. It is important to note that following the independence election, Mugabe had attempted to accommodate ZAPU leaders in his government even when he was not obliged to do so. He had appointed Joshua Komu to the Home Affairs Ministry and other ZAPU leaders the likes of George Salundika, Joseph Msika and others, despite his mandate to form government as ZANU alone. On the integration issue, by choosing the first option, Mugabe obviously created tensions in the new national army, thus the dissident problem worsened in the Matabeleland regions. Mugabe was forced to act to solve these issues harshly by expelling some ZAPU leaders from government and instituting the Gukurahundi events in that region. These events were quite unfortunate to say the least, as they led to carnage and what many termed the suppression of the Ndebele ethnic group. Reflecting on other countries that fought liberation struggles, for example the United States of America. The USA won its independence from British rule, declaring independence from it on the 4th of July 1776, thereby creating a union of various states. After years of unity, tensions within the American Union emerged, whereby some southern states had to secede from the Union on a matter of principle rather than ethnicity. The North and South were at war because of the issue of slavery, with the South wanting to maintain slavery whilst the northern states were opposed to the practice. Brothers from the southern and northern states had to kill each other on matters to do with principle. I will quote the then American President Abraham Lincoln, who says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He continued, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved, I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other. Now I will point out a union that failed in the maintenance of its territorial integrity that is found in the Korean Peninsula. South and North Korea are two brother states that have failed to unite up to now. After World War II in 1945, the Northern Peninsula went under communist rule from the Russians, with the Southern Peninsula being a democratic state under American rule. When the colonial powers Russia and America left the peninsula in 1948, they failed to unite these two states because of their differing governance systems. 2 years later, in 1950, Kim Il-sung tried to unite these two opposing nations into one system by invading the South, but failed, leading to the stalemate currently in the peninsula. The different systems in capitalism and communism have caused permeate divisions between the two brother states. These were the same set of circumstances present for our former Commander-in-Chief Robert Mugabe when reviewing decisions regarding dissidents and events in Matabeleland. He chose to act to keep a greater rift from emerging for our union to remain intact. To some extent, these actions have managed to unite and keep the peace in our union to now. There are surely many counter-arguments present out there on other factors leading to the Gukurahundi events that are highlighted in the documentary Gukurahundi Genocide 38 years later. Narrative saying that the arms caches were stage managed by Mugabe and his intelligence to alienate ZAPU as a political party and thus help him establish a one-party state that he so admired. In the same documentary, interesting admissions from Ms. Hek Valafia, Zipra administrator, are captured, where he confessed that surely Zipra had arms caches in the region, but these were kept for the South African ANC for their struggle against apartheid rule in their country. Other narratives place the idea that these events started because the ZANU government had intelligence that ZAPU had plans to partition the country according to these tribal divisional lines. In a Gukurahundi interview shoot by Zenzile Ndebele interviewing Dumiso Debengwa, the former Zipra commander spoke on the integration process of the National Army and how he felt to have ex-Zanla commanders placed in charge of ex-Zipra-dominated battalions. He explained that the ex-Zipra commanders were more trained than their junior ex-Zanla counterparts who were now their seniors. Mugabe and Komu in 1987 finally decided to bury their hatchets after discussions, thereby signing the Unity Accord on December 22, uniting their ZANU and ZAPU parties into one ZANU-PF. I hope by opening up on this taboo issue, a sincere national engagement processes leading to recognition of these unfortunate events by senior government officials, compensation of victims and healing process can be instituted for the nation to find closure on this contagious issue. If the Gukurahundi issue is not opened up for debate for healing purposes, misguided elements in our political space will continue to use the issue for political gain rather than for national healing purposes, thus threaten the union and territorial integrity as a nation. B. Cultural issues. After this Unity Accord, the country had to move on, and move on it did, but, with high levels of suspicion and a growing unfavorable culture of having government centralize resources and decision-making at the capital Harare. Although this centralization trend worked in favor of the then President Mugabe on his quest to consolidate power and authority, this led to communities that had in the past been directly involved in decision-making through devolved urban councils to lose a say in the running of their affairs. The Urban Councils Acts of 1995 was characterized and built upon the concept of upwards accountability rather than the devolved culture present since independence. The then central government, led by Mugabe for reasons of maintaining territorial integrity and minimizing the effects of risks explained above, started to control each and every lever of power in the country using the state apparatus I alluded to at the beginning. In every strategic option chosen there will be positives and drawback, especially in the case of the Mugabe era, which stretched for a long period. The major drawback to Mugabe amassing this level of power was the death to the culture of openness in both politics and our communities that now lived under these breakaway fears and centralized system of governance. The more centralized the government became, the more power Mugabe had, the more control over government and his party ZANU-PF he assumed. This situation led to a culture of non-contestation of policies. No person could challenge whatever the then president said. This culture also cascaded down to all levels of authority as government and political party officials assumed great power for themselves at the expense of the communities they led. This situation worsened when the opposition, the MDC, emerged in 1999 to now, to which this culture of suppressing those of a different viewpoint, being fully grown. The end of the Mugabe era brought a new culture of openness being expressed in every sphere of our political environment. Never in the time I have lived in Zimbabwe did I see a commission of inquiry being televised to the nation like the 1st of August shooting commission. As a nation we have to be aware that our problems won't be solved overnight, but the Mnangagwa era, though it has its early faults, carries a sincere and genuine commitment on dealing with the dark old issues of intolerance, suppression of freedoms of ethnic groups and political parties. Following these early signs of greater democratization 2 years ago, it is with great concern the recent attempts made by his administration to amend the constitution through the proposed Constitutional Amendment No. 2 of 2019. The proposed amendments again centralize power in the executive on the appointment of judiciary members and other key governance officers that must be independent. This situation might have been necessitated by coup attempts and endless battles on his government's legitimacy, compelling him to now be mainly concerned with self-preservation. The sincerity of the current president and some senior members of his cabinet are haunted by the past on issues to do with suppression of freedoms, intolerance, and even the Gukurahundi massacres. As they always say, no person can change his or her past, but rather one is encouraged to view the past with the intention of addressing future events. President Mnangagwa terms himself to be a servant leader, and for me a servant does not request or demand to be respected like the scenes witnessed in our parliament in recent years. A servant leader is different from a king-like leader we used to have leading us, who did not tolerate challengers or questions on his personal incomes and authority. Many questions we posed to Mugabe about separation of government and personal resources went unanswered. The greatest cultural challenge we are currently having in the country is that of having a heated, unending political climate characterized by one trying to climb with the other pulling down at every turn of our political engagements. It is my wish that these major political parties unite to achieve an honest, open and just culture aimed at speeding our nation-building process. Chapter 7. 2018 Election Results, Complexity and Opportunities. As a country we focus extensively on national elections to the point of neglecting governance issues, which I view as being supreme. Although I have reservations for the subject, I will briefly highlight major complexities and opportunities unearthed by the 30th of July 2018 election result tallies. To put out my opinions and recommendations plainly, let's first summarize the official and contested MDC Alliance summarized vote tallies. Official results published on the 3rd of August 2018, The Herald. Presidential election. 1. Emerson Mnangagwa, ZANU-PF 2,463 votes 50.8%. 2. Nelson Chamisa, MDC Alliance 2,147 votes 44.3%. Presidential elections according to Nelson Chamisa submitted to Commission November 26, 2018. 1. Nelson Chamisa, MDC Alliance 2,674 320 votes 57.1%. 2. Emerson Mnangagwa, ZANU-PF 2008 639 votes 42.1%. Official results for other branches of government. House of National Assembly. 1. ZANU-PF. 145 seats. 69%. 2. MDC Alliance. 63 seats. 30%. 3. NPF. 1 seat. 0.5%. 4. Independent. 1 seat. 0.5%. Total. 210 seats. Current structure of National Assembly after proportional representation. 1. ZANU, PF, 179 seats. 66.2%. 2. MDC, Alliance. 88 seats. 32.6%. 3. NPF. 1 seat. 0.4%. 4. MDCT. 1 seat. 0.4%. 5. Independent. 1 seat. 0.4%. Total. 270 seats. Senate structure. 1. ZANU, PF. 34 seats. 42.5%. 2. MDC Alliance. 25 seats. 31.3%. 3. Chiefs Council. 18 seats. 22.5%. 4. People with Disability 2 seats. 2.5%. 5. MDC, T. 1 seat. 1.2%. Total. 80 seats. Urban Councils. 1. MDC Alliance. 26 councils. 81.3%. 2. ZANU PF, 6 councils. 18.7%. Total. 32 councils. Complexities. The first complexity comes with all presidential result tallies, the official and the MDC Alliance tally. The honest conclusion is that we are truly a divided country with about an equal following for both these political establishments. Taking the MDC Alliance result tally as being credible, thus having Chamisa as president will possess major hindrances on forming a functional administration. This is so for the MDC Alliance accepted the parliamentary results for which ZANU PF attained a 2/3 majority needed for effective governance. If Chamisa is to require major policy changes in the form of legislation, on submission of bills to the parliament they would be a high chance of them being rejected by the ZANU PF majority. A Chamisa administration will also be prone to the impeachment clause, thus reducing its effectiveness. Another complex interpretation of all the result tallies is how these votes were divided on a community level. Analyzing the parliamentary and urban council results, you clearly see the electoral bases of the two parties ZANU PF and MDC Alliance. ZANU PF, the ruling party's strength is in the rural areas, with the MDC Alliance controlling 81% of the urban councils. It is also very difficult for the current ZANU PF administration to effectively govern without the support of the urban population, for most policy changes are meant for the urban population. Opportunities. The divide in the overall vote tallies can also be analyzed on a geographical basis, creating significant governance opportunities. This divide can be crucial in the development of a culture of decentralization in decision-making. The Constitution of 2013 already advocates for the creation of devolved provincial councils. The main political formations are crucial in a national dialogue process in the creation of these devolution laws. The desired devolution laws are also vital for the promotion of an open, just and united society that does not suppress ethnic groups on the allocation of resources and decisions concerning their own affairs as communities. In a town hall meeting in Bulawayo hosted by the VOA and Media Center aimed at evaluating the first 100 days of President Mnangagwa, the biggest issue arising from the Matabeleland regions are rights to their own resources, by wanting these devolution laws to be expedited. In the previous chapter, when explaining about Gukurahundi, I also highlighted on how devolution had been successful following the country's independence and how it was ended in favor of a centralized decision-making system under the Mugabe administration. Before this centralization, urban councils possessed significant functions and powers that included the generation and distribution of electricity, water treatment and distribution to households, housing, road maintenance, construction works, sewage relief and many other functions which were then centralized as per Mugabe orders. The changing and updating of the Urban Councils Act in 1995 created centralized national institutions like ZISA, ZINWA, and later on when the main opposition the MDC emerged others like ZINARA. Cabinet posts in Ministers of State in the 10 provinces and the Minister of Local Government were also established. These were all attempts by the ZANU-PF-led administration on maintaining control in urban councils in which the party had not been elected to lead. In a study by Wellington Jonga on local government system in Zimbabwe and associated challenges, he points out that one of the major issues hindering the effectiveness of urban councils are that of having councillors voted into councils that don't possess any academic or post-academic qualifications. These councillors will be having powers to direct council activities and employees that might be more educated and skilled than them, thereby creating tensions. Chapter 8. Zimbabwe's Succession Quagmire and Chamisa Options. Being an ardent student of history, I am going to apply a historical perspective to the current stage and events in our development towards a fully matured democratic and prosperous nation. I will use two nations that had similar struggles against oppression before attaining their independence as ours, the United States of America, USA, and our own neighbor South Africa, SA. Some of the insights I am going to share, most people will find offensive, especially those in the opposition. These truths are worth knowing, for it is said that those who do not learn from history are condemned to suffer and repeat its ugly consequences. Entering the 2018, 30th of July elections, awareness of these truths guided my own decisions and perceptions. The first fact is that both the United States of America and South Africa for the period following their independence had successive presidents that were directly linked to the struggle against oppression they had concluded. The USA had George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and lastly James Monroe being their founding leaders in succession. All these American founding fathers with the exception of John Adams were soldiers in the American Revolution. However, John Adams was instrumental in the Declaration of Independence, acting as a diplomat during the Revolution and advocating for the ratification of the Constitution post-independence. In South Africa the same fact holds as following their freedom from apartheid rule, they had Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, Galima Motlanthe, Jacob Zuma and now Cyril Ramaphosa as their leaders in succession. All these leaders were also directly involved in their struggle against apartheid rule. They also faced imprisonment, with some helping in the drafting of the Constitution and others acting as diplomats during their struggle. The best thing about these two nations was the influence to their democratic maturing process the founding presidents in Mandela and Washington had on setting a valuable precedent on the smooth transfer of power to younger generations. Regardless of the fact that both leaders had almost unanimous support following their heroic plights, George Washington only served for 2 consecutive 4-year terms, with Nelson Mandela serving a single 5-year term, handing over power to younger generations of fellow founding fathers. In Zimbabwe our democratic maturing problem started when our founding president in Robert Mugabe failed in setting a similar precedent over the smooth transfer of power, as it required a coup to depose him from office. Mugabe ruled for over 37 years, failing to trust his fellow comrades and thus failed to hand over power to younger founding fathers that he had alongside him during their heroic plights in the Zimbabwean Revolution. As the country entered the 2018 harmonized election season that preceded Mugabe's deposition, frankly speaking, there was literally no possibility for the country's presidency to have been transferred to those who were non-founding fathers. The election was a hard-fought battle that inspired the young generation, but in the end the reality of what could have reigned was very much so distant, for without having Zimbabwe being led by another founding father other than Mugabe was impossible. When President Mnangagwa managed to depose his predecessor, many in the opposition had thought an election's victory was imminent, but this calculation was not complete, for a certain historical reality had yet been fulfilled. In the United States of America, time eventually came for post-liberation leaders to be at the helm of leadership, but this required a certain level of patience, commitment to learn the nation's values from the founders, and resolve to help enhance the democratic space on the part of the young. The American founding fathers also recognized that they were expendable over time, and hence it became essential for them to nurture a generation of younger post-liberation leaders. In the Zimbabwean context, I would first like to commend Nelson Chamisa, the leader of the MDC Alliance opposition, for his performance in the July 2018 election. Considering the limited time he had to campaign for the poll, he ran a stupendous race. The qualities and attributes which he now has to display are on his strategic decision-making and bargaining skills from that election result. I will explore some of his options, looking at their positives and drawbacks for the nation's economy, his political career, and the country's democratic maturing. I am of the opinion that it's now time for Nelson Chamisa to make critical decisions that will greatly assist the country's democratic maturing process. This is the only way for him to prove his worth, for when confronted with adversity, possessing a plan on how to mitigate predicaments are qualities that define true leadership. Mitigation plans can either take a long-term perspective, for the opposition leader is still relatively young. He will be assured in the end to be at the helm of the country's leadership if he manages to play his cards right. At present, the opposition's case against President Mnangagwa's legitimacy is an extremely difficult case to prove in comparison with the late Morgan Tsvangirai position in the aftermath of the 2008 election. In 2008, the MDC-T, then led by Tsvangirai, and the MDC-N, then led by Mutambra, had a combined opposition majority in parliament over ZANU-PF. This is not the case now, for ZANU-PF controls a two-thirds majority over. Going into the 2008 runoff second-round election, the voting process was marred by violence and human rights abuses. The MDC-T opposition, led by Tsvangirai, had to withdraw from these polls, with the regional body SADC and the African Union observer missions unqualifying the election process, damaging the legitimacy of former President Robert Mugabe. In the case of the 2018 elections, not only did we have SADC and the African Union elections observer missions, the voting process was also observed by international bodies from the European Union and the Commonwealth election observer missions. Although most of these observer missions had reservations in fully qualifying the election process as being fully fair, credible and transparent, they gave a certain level of credibility accompanied by a great deal of recommendations on issues and legislations that could be improved in the next election. Their general view was that Zimbabwe was surely on the path to fully opening up its democratic space from being in international isolation for a great number of years. This background brings us the first options and current strategy being used by Nelson Chamisa and his MDC Alliance Party, that of wearing down from the sidelines all governmental policies and programs. When the government announces a certain policy action, the opposition party responds immediately by criticizing it as much as possible, thereby creating an environment of low confidence in the country's leadership to the domestic and international community. The MDC Alliance is betting that this lack of confidence is going to lead to economic decline, social unrest, for no meaningful cooperation and investment with the right partnering countries would be achieved. This lack of meaningful international cooperation and re-engagement is emanating from mixed signals about the situation in the country coming out of the country's political divide to the world. When economic and political unrest is fully matured, the MDC Alliance hopes this will achieve civil disobedience. This disobedience, they know very well, will be met by an unproportionate response, exceptionally lethal due to the nature of our leaders. This will surely damage the credibility of the current government to the international community, and hope that the community will intervene in our internal political crises. The effect of the current MDC Alliance strategy to Zimbabwe is that the culture of division and hate will continue, reaching to unprecedented levels. This can be observed by the hate actions and speech that are now prevalent in the country. The effect to Nelson Chamisa's political career is quite minimal, as he is still capitalizing on the emotions of his political base post the 30th of July 2018 poll. The danger for his career can only come when people set aside their emotions in search of real issues behind our economic woes. The other threat can emerge from within his political party or country, where an alternative leader possessing a comprehensive action plan makes a leadership challenge with preserved potential of the immediate improvement of livelihoods of ordinary citizens. The other major question is, will this strategy earn Nelson Chamisa the presidency? To some extent it might achieve his goal, but in a very destructive manner to the democratic setup and maturing desire. This will again mean that the country would have failed on making a smooth transition of political power since attaining independence. The strategy is also heavily reliant on the regional, continental and international community's intervention. The biggest sticking point is the basis to which these groupings can and might intervene. These groupings were given access to observe the recent elections as they gave their recommendations that can only be resolved if the current parliament and arms of government are fully functional. I would like to believe that to some extent the international community at this moment is actually confused on how to deal with Zimbabwe. This was evident from the recent reviews made by the European Union that failed at extending the country's sanction regime despite human rights abuses and killings in the past years. The real concrete recommendation coming out from both the European Union and the United States is for the political divide in Zimbabwe to find each other through national dialogue. It is my belief the community is ready to cooperate and review Zimbabwe's sanctions only if the situation of mixed signals ends. The community is still extending a chance on re-engagement with the government of President Mnangagwa, to which the major opposition party is failing on. The second option will be to accept the national dialogue process but insist on significantly altering the governance structures to promote accountability, efficiency, and effectiveness in the government's operations. This is a long-term view and less destructive route bent on working on the recommendations posed by international observer missions and countries seeking re-engagement. The effects of this strategy to our country are that the culture of political tolerance, inclusivity in decisions-making, accountability and openness will be enhanced. This will be very much different from the current environment of a wait-and-see, they-will-do-nothing helpful attitude bent on pulling down a political opponent at every turn. This will also help the general organizational culture in Zimbabwe I observed working in different state-owned companies of departmentalization. The current model of idea acceptance in business or politics is based on status, position, profession or political party belonged rather than if the actual idea, action plan or policy change will hold after being subjected to process of interrogation of proposed plans and facts. The country will also be able to speak in a single and united voice to the international community. The issues that the opposition leader can insist on are on changing the presidential roles from executive roles to being both executive and parliamentary, increasing the frequency the president and cabinet visit the parliament to answer questions. The impact on Nelson Chamisa's political career will not be clear, for he has significantly delayed this option, to which many lives have been lost only for him in the end to accept President Mnangagwa's legitimacy. This situation will definitely lead to a strong leadership challenge within his party from hardliners who are against cooperating with the present government. His political life will depend on his political maneuvering ability and posturing skills. Challengers will also depend on the type of political positions secured for fellow senior party members in any power-sharing arrangement with the Mnangagwa government. In my opinion, Chamisa has delayed significantly in taking this option and now risks damaging his political career, although this option will save the country's economic and political fortunes. The last option will be an all-out combative fight against the current government. This will mean that the opposition leader should consider recruiting and arming a dissident force. This might lead to destruction of the nation's property and human lives. This might also aid Chamisa's course in the attainment of the political helm of the country, but again the country's democratic maturing would have failed on the smooth transfer of political power. The current problem in our policy formulation and implementation is that of war veterans that override plans claiming entitlements as benefits of their past heroic plights will also be perpetuated by these new heroes. Although political power transferred from President Mugabe to President Mnangagwa, this transfer put the country in the first quagmire, as this was not constitutional, legal and smooth, requiring national dialogue to resolve. It is also time for the opposition leader to choose either option whilst he still has control over events. The longer he delays, the greater the risk of losing control of events, for I know that the Zimbabwean population's focus is easily taken away by small things. Chapter 9. Whites score big against blacks, land compensation. Land is and was at the center of all political developments for the indigenous black Zimbabwean population's pre- and post-independence movements. The liberation war against white minority rules black political formations were all created on the principle of repossessing and redistributing land to the black indigenous population as their formation basis. The main post-liberation political formations, Zimbabwe United Movement, ZUM, 1989 and MDC in 1999 were also formed with alternative plans on accruing and redistributing land to ordinary Zimbabweans. Henceforth the recently proposed program by the Zimbabwean government to compensate former white farmers is an indication of our former colonizers' ability to getting the better of the black population at every turn due to their skilled abilities of playing the long game. Background. In the Lancaster House Conference of 1979, land reform emerged as the most crucial issue during talks. Robert Mugabe, ZANU, and Joshua Komu, ZAPU, then united as the Patriotic Front, insisted on the redistribution of land by compulsory seizure without compensation as a precondition to a negotiated peace settlement. The British government that mediated the process proposed an alternative plan inserting Constitutional Clause Section 16 aiming to prevent mass farm invasions, thereby underscoring their desire on maintaining land ownership rights for white farmers. The British proposed a willing buyer-willing seller arrangement on both the land and improvements made on it. This clause was to be in place for the first 10 years in which the Lancaster House Constitution was to be adopted by the new liberated Zimbabwean nation. After this 10-year period the indigenous people were to decide on how to proceed with the land reform, thereby drafting their own constitution. It is important to note that Mugabe and Komu were against the idea of compensating white farmers in any regard. These leaders considered the liberation struggle they had waged as premised on reversing the unjust land seizures the indigenous population had been subjected to by the white colonial power in periods preceding this peace settlement. As a prelude to securing Mugabe and Komu's consent for the peace settlement and constitutional agreement, the British government through Lord Carrington announced that United Kingdom would assist the land resettlement technically and financially. The decision point which brings the United States of America to the fold are assurances made that they would also likewise contribute capital for a substantial amount for a process of land redistribution and would also encourage the British government to give similar assurances. The American assurance came through Kingman Brewster, their ambassador in London then. The other decision point that led Mugabe and Komu to accept these terms are the pressures from other frontline states, most notably from former Mozambican President Samora Machel. Following Mozambique's liberation struggle from Portuguese rule and subsequent independence, the indigenous blacks hastily seized all means of production, chasing away their former colonizers to their own demise. During the Lancaster House Conference period the Mozambican economy had grinded to a halt, hence Machel warned our leaders on implications of taking similar actions. The Zanla and Zipra fighting forces had also been stationed in both Mozambique and Zambia, whose economies were significantly funded by the British and American governments. This economic assistance was at threat if their leaders were to fail in convincing Mugabe and Komu on terms tabled at the conference. These were the decisions points that compelled Mugabe and Komu to accept the Lancaster House Conference Agreement. Land Reform 1980 to 1989. In the first 3 years after independence, land resettlement for the indigenous population happened rapidly. This was mainly abandoned land, war zone areas and land sold to the government from willing white sellers who had little confidence in the new administration as they were leaving the country. Around 80% of the land purchased under the willing buyer-willing seller arrangement in the first decade was undertaken between 1980 and 1983. The average agricultural land payment ratio was $1, $1.5, that is the Zimbabwe to British government support. The process slowed after 3 years as political stability increased due to the reconciliation policy implemented by Mugabe's administration. Going forward, finding willing sellers became difficult, and when found, property prices had also gone up significantly. After the drought of 1983, Zimbabwe could no longer sustain the land reform project, focusing more on education as the budget deficit required tightening. The British government also set stiff conditions on meeting their payout portions. These terms were unattainable, such as the level of detailed planning requirement that needed surveying skills to which the country lacked at that stage of its development. In the years to 1989, around 52,000 families had been resettled, to which the local white farmer-dominated Commercial Farmers Union, CFU, and British government assessed as being significant progress. Their assessment came before the willing buyer-willing seller arrangement was scheduled to end in April 1990. This assessment was divergent, as on December 20, 1989, the Herald of Zimbabwe reported Robert Mugabe saying that for his government, the biggest single problem yet to resolve was that of land distribution. He went on to promise delegates at the first ZANU-PF Congress that with Lancaster House agreements soon coming to an end, his government must simply deal more effectively, speedily and decisively with the land question. Major issues 1990 to 1997. Towards the end of the first decade of independence, corruption had surfaced as a major problem in the ZANU-PF-led government. Scandals in Willowgate, involving top senior government officials, had received widespread media coverage across the continent and world. The corruption conviction and pardons made by former President R.G. Mugabe were for one reason: I observe with national political party systems which are of comradeship, not scrupulousness. The fact that political party members have struggled together for long periods in order to attain political power would make it convenient to overlook ill deeds of fellow comrades for party domination and stability. Observing these major political weaknesses possessed by ruling comradeship-based ZANU-PF, the American and British governments planned for the end of the Lancaster House Agreement and Constitution. These powers enticed Zimbabwe to the IMF Economic Structural Adjustment Development Program (ESAP). This policy plan and implementation project was made to look like a locally driven program similar to the measures being placed on the country to rejoin the IMF recently. At the time, the country was in need of creating greater employment for its growing educated population coming through the well-funded education system. The country was enticed to acquire these international loans and thus eliminate inefficiencies through cutting the subsidy program, removing tariffs that protected local industry and cutting on the civil services. The gamble was towards investing in the productive sectors, thereby enlarging export revenues required for the repayment of the same international loans. The first downfall for this IMF ESAP plan was that no concrete investments in productive industries and modern machinery aimed at creating these production synergies were made. The fact that these agreements tied the country to certain obligations like supplying maize to other countries even in the drought period of 1993 created more economical ills. The Zimbabwe government had then committed to making foreign currency repayments from a depleted productive sector, which was now also open to imports as tariffs had been removed. This American and British IMF-backed strategy technically killed all hopes of the continued adherence to the willing buyer-willing seller arrangement as land resettlement funds dried up. This plan technically cured the land question for the period between 1990 and 1997, as most of these international loans were significantly unsustainable. The Santana Vehicle Loan Agreement technically meant that money just moved from one account in the UK to the next without giving the government the productive capacity required in paying back this international loan. Major issues in 1997 to 2001. At the beginning of 1997 they were rising food prices, fuel shortages, rising levels of unemployment and discontent in the population shown by the rise of civil disobedience through countrywide strikes. The critical bones of contentions came from the war veterans who felt greatly excluded from economic activity and a feeling of betrayal by the then government on the land reform issue. The government had moved at a slow pace under the willing buyer-willing seller arrangement of the then Constitution. Another critical issue was of the abuse of funds under the War Victims' Compensation Act of 1993, where the Chidyazaku Commission report of August 1997 pointed to major payouts going to senior ZANU-PF officials. The stage was set for a major confrontation between ZANU-PF and the War Veterans Association, thus the then President R.G. Mugabe had to act. In September 1997, all veterans were given a payout of $50,000 in an attempt to silence them, but two critical trends emerged from there. The economic trend of the country worsened since these funds were not economically backed in any form, thus the inflation rate spiraled. The second critical trend was the empowerment of the War Veterans Association that resulted in it strongly affecting government policy up to today. If self-reflection had taken place following the Chidyazaku report, a reform process would have helped to stamp out corruption in ZANU-PF and government. This realignment and self-reflection process would have helped in the economic trajectory of the country and most importantly produce reforms that would have expedited land reform. However, a reactionary, quick but dangerous solution was applied that protected the party and war veterans' interests at the expense of the nation. In the same 1997, civil society groups organized themselves along the National Constitutional Assembly, NCA, demanding economic, social and political reforms including advocating for a new constitution. Despite all these domestic pressures, in June 1998 the government sent the first group of 11,000 soldiers to the Democratic Republic of Congo to prop up President Laurent Kabila to fight off rebels in his country. In 1999, the MDC was formed presenting a challenge to the ZANU-PF-led government promising national renewal on the economic, political and social front with that also promising on land reform. The party promised a people-driven process that aimed to acquire 6 to 7 million hectares of land through acquiring underutilized, derelict and multiple-owned land for redistribution to ordinary landless Zimbabweans. The MDC's proposals were a major challenge to the ZANU-PF-led government's land reform program that had moved at a slow pace especially at a time where its relationship with international donors had collapsed with the government being blamed for donor fund mismanagement and disregarding guidelines agreed under the International Donors Conference on Land Reform and Resettlement of September 1998 held in Harare. The reasons cited by donors were the government's lack of transparency and abuse of donor funds with major benefits going to senior government and party officials at the expense of the common man. Major issues 2000 to now. In June 2000, the country was to have parliamentary elections, thus the war veterans and ZANU-PF government reacted to this MDC threat by accelerating the land reform. This was the start of the reactionary fast-paced land reform program where for the first time the army started involving itself in the internal affairs of the country. Reflecting on the outcomes of the land reform program to the present day, what I can say is that the land is now in the hands of the black population. The country might have delayed the pains that had been highlighted at Lancaster by Mozambican President Samora Machel that radically implementing land reform would cripple the economy, but it's an inevitable process for a nation to really possess all the means of production. Over that period to now many myths like only white farmers are the ones technically capable of growing tobacco successfully and no black person can efficiently run a thriving farm have all now been demystified. As the land compensation debate rages on within the country, reactions from most of the country's youths have been against the compensation, meaning that they now value land ownership. Transformation leadership is the art of taking people where they themselves would not choose due to the pains of changing course, thus leaving the comforts of being an ordinary employed individual to be a master of one's own destiny is a big deal. Former President Robert Mugabe pressed on despite international condemnation and economic decline the country faced. President R.G. Mugabe knew that it was not the approval of the lead he needed then, for they had been comfortable with the status quo. To do what is right sometimes does not feel good, but Mugabe knew that in the end we were going to appreciate and cherish his leadership. Changing course is a big deal, and we don't always have to ask for the white man's approval, for they are certainly not our friends. They don't really want us to be shapers of our own destinies and will fight tooth and nail to have these ideas of non-dependency on their capitals extinguished. The area of alarming concern currently is on our policy formulation and implementation procedures. Due to the political tensions that are now ever present from having two influential national political parties in ZANU-PF and MDC, our policy formulation and implementation processes have been turned to a constant mode of being reactionary. The system is that when one political party proposes a good policy program, due to this tension and contest for total political control, the other reacts in ways that might amount to sabotage, thus removing the rational element needed to move the country forward. Constitutional issues. The Constitution of 2013 possesses clauses in which compensation can be made for the improvements made on agricultural land by former white farmers under Chapter 16. This compensation is only limited to improvements, not agricultural land. For agricultural land I will refer to Section 72 Clauses 7 and 8 below. 7. In regard to the compulsory acquisition of agricultural land for the resettlement of people in accordance with a program of land reform, the following factors must be regarded as of ultimate and overriding importance. A. Under colonial domination, the people of Zimbabwe were unjustifiably dispossessed of their land and other resources without compensation. B. The people consequently took up arms in order to regain their land and political sovereignty, and this ultimately resulted in the independence of Zimbabwe in 1980. C. The people of Zimbabwe must be enabled to reassert their rights and regain ownership of their land, and accordingly, I. The former colonial power has an obligation to pay compensation for agricultural land compulsorily acquired for resettlement, through an adequate fund established for the purpose, and 2. If the former colonial power fails to pay compensation through such a fund, the government of Zimbabwe has no obligation to pay compensation for agricultural land compulsorily acquired for resettlement. 8. This section applies without prejudice to the obligation of the former colonial power to pay compensation for land referred to in this section that has been acquired for resettlement purposes. South Africa and its own land reform. South African politicians have been in arms over the decision made by the Zimbabwean government to compensate former white farmers at a time when our country's economy is barely making it. I believe an attack on Zimbabwe's land reform program is an attack on the proposed South African land reform program too. South Africa wonders how this has happened. Zimbabwe has for a long time lived in international isolation for radically taking back its land during the year 2000. From then the country has been starved of any meaningful capital investment and foreign currency inflows. The administration of President Mnangagwa came in promising on re-engagement with the international community. The truth of the matter is that Mnangagwa has not been given any chance to prove himself, for just after assuming office 7 months from there he had an election to contend with. This election battle was fierce to the extent of creating other influential internal enemies. His election victory was relatively slim, contested and marred by post-election violence and killings of 6 civilians. The election opponents then are yet to move on from these events and possess significant support in the mainly urban areas where most policy changes are made. Mnangagwa over this entire period has faced constant pressure on delivering internal stability, to which in my opinion will be unattainable considering our highly polarized political environment. Efforts to reconcile with his fellow influential younger countrymen have been snubbed by the main opposition. This environment has made it very difficult for international investors to invest in the country. There were reports that our former colonial powers were also behind the internecine political environment, as they were implicated in the January 2019 stay-away and violence actions. These internal tensions and the economic collapse have isolated President Mnangagwa in his desperate position towards finding financial relief. The South African government in December 2018 was approached by his administration for a credit facility to relieve some of these financial pressures. Zimbabwe's main foreign currency earners are gold and tobacco, which post seasonal revenues. The plan then was on creating currency stability, preparing for the coming seasons and covering import bills like for wheat and fuel, but the loan failed to come through, resulting in the economic collapse of January 2019. All these factors have now forced President Mnangagwa to resort to his last option, that is the American-backed IMF. The IMF already has re-engagement terms highlighted in the Zidara sanction bills, to which the act was mainly enacted towards derailing the success of the land reform program. This is the desperate position in which our president finds himself, and yes, South African politicians can talk and claim many things, but talk is cheap, for when the country's assistance was requested it decided against expending. As I have said before, an attack of Zimbabwe's land reform program is an attack on South Africa's proposed program. This is the reason I say in the title, whites always win against us the blacks. How the IMF is penalizing Zimbabwe for carrying out rapid land reform is an example being given to South Africa's current land reform question. As blacks we always fail we play the short game and fail to see the long-term consequences, and now these are the implications of the denied loan. It is technically deplorable and devilish for the IMF to impose such stiff measures on Zimbabwe's readmission, such as requiring the country to compensate former white farmers at a time when the country's economy is in a mess, having recently experienced a natural disaster and facing a drought in the same year. All weapons internally and externally have been formed against President Mnangagwa, and now he has given in to one of the international community's terms. We now just wonder what their next demand will be. As for now, the whites have us exactly where they want. I guess that their next demand will be on legalizing gay rights. Conclusions. The American government has had successive administrations in George Bush's who enacted ZIDRA to Barack Obama and now Donald Trump, all maintaining their country's position and policy consistently. This policy also contains several covert programs to cause the current disability in the country in the name of human rights. While we are busy playing the short game on who's supposed to be the president, fighting on and on to the extent of destroying our economy, the Americans through the IMF have now moved in with their terms. The next step for the IMF is an economic program just like ESAP, in which Zimbabwe will be extended financial support in a mortgage type of arrangement against our resources, like what the Chinese are currently doing. If we are not financially disciplined like in the 1990s, we risk losing everything now. I have also said it before that I don't really care who between Chamisa or Mnangagwa should be president, for that's not the national priority at the moment. The priority is on improving accountability in our governance structures and decisive currency reforms where both leaders have significant roles to play. A unity government can partially help remove tensions in the political arena, but alone without removing clauses like Section 129K will not get rid of comradeship and short-term thinking. In my first published opinion article titled, Mugabe There is Victory in Losing, I highlighted to short-term thinking and political party maneuvering as major problems of the GNU arrangements ending from 2012 to 2013 when elections were to be held. Decisions made in this period were again mainly on furthering political party interest, not national interest. ZANU-PF came in with the indigenization policy, which was too radical then, and both parties refused the ban on the importation of second-hand vehicles due to fears of losing voters in the coming election. The effects of not creating laws that would have fostered local production as opposed to foreign currency leakages through importations are now being felt today as the country now faces these foreign currency shortages. In the end, Zimbabwe should reconsider the meaning and holding of constant elections with the current constitutional provisions and governance systems. The current system does not allow for diverse opinions to be expressed, heard and decided upon, only allowing a few individuals to set the political tone without any challenges. This practice is against the democratic principles I explained in earlier chapters. Holding constant elections with the current condition of a winner-takes-all mentality has led to our political establishment employing a short-term vision on campaigns and their administrations. The worst outcome from these constant political battles is on possessing an ambiguous national vision driven by the idea of political formation's attainment of political office. If the situation persists, external forces and hostile nations will continue getting the better of us. As we play our short-term political game, it is extremely imperative for all of Zimbabwe's political establishment to conduct a self-reflection process aimed at reevaluating and devising a common shared vision that transcends political affiliations. The end. Stay blessed.